Welcome, and thank you for being here. If you enjoy stories like this one, told slowly and with care through the quiet hours of the night, consider subscribing to this channel, where new sleep documentaries arrive regularly, each one an invitation to rest your mind and let a story carry you gently into sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with a man worth knowing. Not a man who is simple to understand, or easy to summarize, or comfortable to reduce to a single defining quality, but a man who is, in the fullest and most human sense of the word, trying to be a good father, a good scientist, a good husband, a good person, and living with the knowledge that something inside him sometimes makes all of that extraordinarily difficult. His name is Curt Connors, and his story begins not with a monster, but with a boy. Settle in now. Let your body grow heavy and your breathing slow. There is nowhere else to be tonight, and nothing that needs your attention until morning. The story will come to you gently, like the sound of water moving through tall grass, like the particular warmth of a summer night in a place where the world feels very old and very alive. Just listen and let it carry you. There is a particular quality to the light in a small Pennsylvania town on an autumn afternoon, in the years just after the middle of the 20th century, a soft, gold-edged light that falls through the turning leaves of maple and oak trees and lies in long warm patches across wooden porches and quiet streets. It is the kind of light that belongs to a world that moves slowly, that measures time in seasons rather than minutes, that understands the value of patience in a way that more hurried places tend to forget. Curt Connors grew up in that light. He was born and raised in a modest house in a small community not far from Sunbury in central Pennsylvania, the son of people who worked with their hands and believed in the quiet virtues of diligence and honesty and care for the people around them. His father was a man who could fix almost anything that broke, who approached every problem with the same steady attention, who taught his son by example that the most important response to a difficult situation was not panic, but patience. His mother was a woman of considerable warmth and considerable intelligence, someone who had read widely and thought carefully, and who recognized in her son, from very early on, a mind that needed more room than a small town's ordinary rhythms could easily provide. Curtis was, by most outward measures, a quiet child. He was not the kind of boy who dominated a room or sought the attention of everyone in it. He was more likely to be found at the edges of things, watching carefully, thinking about what he observed. His teachers noted early that he had an unusual capacity for concentration, an ability to stay with a problem or a question long past the point where other children had moved on to something else. This quality, which could look like stubbornness from the outside, was in fact something closer to devotion. When Curt Connors became interested in something, he became genuinely, completely interested in it. In the way that certain rare people are capable of giving themselves over to a subject entirely. And from a very young age, the subject that commanded this kind of devotion was the natural world. Not in an abstract or theoretical way, not through books alone, though he read them constantly, but in the specific, immediate, sensory way of a child who spent every available hour outside, crouching beside ponds and streams and overturned logs, watching the creatures that lived in those places with an attention that was almost reverential. He was fascinated by insects, by amphibians, by the small mammals that moved through the undergrowth of the Pennsylvania countryside, but it was reptiles that captivated him most completely. There was something about them that he found endlessly compelling. Their patience, which matched something in his own temperament, their extraordinary efficiency, the sense that nothing about their biology was wasted or accidental, that every scale and sinew had been refined by millions of years of pressure into exactly what it needed to be, and above all their capacity for regeneration, the way certain lizards could lose a tail to a predator and simply, quietly, grow it back. He had read about this in the library books his mother brought home for him, and then he had seen it for himself, watching a small skink in the garden regenerate the last inch of its tail over the course of several weeks, checking on it every morning with a scientific attention that would not have been out of place in a university laboratory. He was 9 years old when he first saw this happen. He was 12 when he wrote his first careful notes about it in a composition book he kept in his desk drawer. He was 14 when he asked his biology teacher, a patient man named Mr. Hargrove, who recognized genuine curiosity when he encountered it. Whether anyone had ever tried to understand the biochemical mechanism behind lizard regeneration well enough to apply it to human medicine, Mr. Hargrove told him that yes, people had tried, and that it was one of the most interesting and difficult problems in the whole field of tissue biology. Curt Connors went home that afternoon and sat at his desk for a very long time, thinking about that answer. He was not, to be clear, a prodigy in the showy sense of the word. He did not solve problems that baffled adult scientists or publish papers before finishing high school. What he had was something quieter, and in many ways more durable than prodigious talent. He had a genuinely scientific temperament. He understood, even as a teenager, that real science was slow, that the most important discoveries were built on layers of careful, patient, often mundane work, on measurements taken and repeated and taken again, on hypotheses tested and revised and tested again. He did not expect the world to yield its secrets quickly, and he was prepared to wait for them. His high school years passed in this spirit of quiet, disciplined inquiry. He excelled in biology and chemistry and mathematics, not because he was competing with anyone, but because these subjects genuinely absorbed him. He had friends, a small number of close ones, people who appreciated his steady presence and his willingness to listen carefully and his tendency to say something genuinely useful when he spoke. He was not popular in the conventional teenage sense, but he was respected, which meant considerably more to him. He was the kind of young man that other people, even at 17 and 18, instinctively trusted with important things. The dream that was forming during these years was already quite specific, even if its technical dimensions would take decades to fill in. Curt Connors wanted to understand the biological mechanisms of regeneration well enough to use them to help people who had lost limbs or suffered damage to their nervous tissue. He wanted to take what the lizards had known for millions of years and translate it into something that a surgeon could use in a hospital. It was a dream of great ambition, but it was not an arrogant dream. It was not driven by the desire for recognition or the hunger for a place in the history of science. It was driven by something considerably simpler and, in its simplicity, considerably more powerful. He wanted to help people. He had seen, in his own community, people living with the consequences of injury and illness, people who had lost the use of limbs or who had suffered damage that medicine could not repair. He had felt, in his particular way, the weight of that loss, not dramatically or sentimentally, but with the quiet, clear-eyed attention that was characteristic of everything he did. And he had looked at the skink in the garden regenerating its tail and thought that the answer to at least some of that suffering was already present in the world, waiting to be understood and applied. That thought, formed in the mind of a thoughtful boy watching a small creature in a Pennsylvania garden, would guide the next 30 years of his life. It would take him through medical school and into surgery and out to Florida and into a laboratory that smelled of chemicals and salt air and living things. It would bring him the most extraordinary triumph of his career and the most devastating loss of his sense of self. It would make him, in ways he never intended and could never have predicted, into something that both contained and exceeded the boy from Sunbury. But all of that was still a long way ahead. Lying quiet in a future that the boy sitting at his desk on an autumn afternoon in Pennsylvania had no way of seeing. What he could see, through his bedroom window, was the gold and amber of the turning leaves, and the slow deepening of the light toward evening, and beyond the garden, the small corner of the natural world that had been his first teacher. He looked at it for a long time before returning to his books. Then he opened the composition notebook to a fresh page, picked up his pen, and began to write. The boy who had watched lizards in a Pennsylvania garden grew into a young man who understood, with increasing clarity, exactly where he needed to go. The path from Sunbury to medical school was not a short one, and it was not always easy, but it was the path that Curt Connors had been walking toward since he was 9 years old. And when he finally arrived at the beginning of it, there was something in him that recognized it as inevitable. The way a river recognizes the sea. He attended university on a combination of academic scholarships and the careful savings of parents who believed in him completely and asked very little in return, except that he work hard and remain the person they had raised him to be. He studied biology and chemistry with the same focused devotion that had characterized his work since childhood, and he added to these the mathematics and physics and biochemistry that a serious scientific education required. His professors found him to be an unusual student, Not the most immediately dazzling mind in any given room, but consistently the most thorough, the most careful, the most genuinely engaged with the material for its own sake rather than for the grade it might produce. He asked the kind of questions that suggested he had been thinking about a problem long before class began, and would continue thinking about it long after class ended. It was during his undergraduate years that Connors first encountered the published literature on reptilian regeneration in any serious depth, moving beyond the popular science books of his childhood into the actual research journals where the slow, incremental work of real science was documented. He read everything he could find on the subject, and he found, as serious researchers always find when they begin to explore the edges of a field, that the more he learned, the more clearly he could see the shape of what was not yet known. The mechanisms underlying limb regeneration in lizards and salamanders were understood in broad outline, but not in the fine biochemical detail that would be necessary to translate the process into a clinical application. The gap between what was known and what would be needed was vast. He found this not discouraging but clarifying. It told him exactly where the work needed to be done. Medical school followed, at an institution in the northeast where the faculty included several researchers whose work on tissue biology and cellular regeneration Connors had been reading for years. He arrived there as a young man in his early 20s with a specific intellectual agenda and the discipline to pursue it. But he arrived also with the genuine openness of someone who understood that he had a great deal still to learn. Medical school has a way of revealing the distance between what a student thinks they know and what a physician actually needs to know, and Connors navigated this revelation with his characteristic patience, absorbing everything the curriculum offered while also maintaining the thread of his own research interests through the long demanding years of training. He proved to be an exceptional surgeon. This was in some ways a surprise to him, though it should not have been. The qualities that made him a good scientist, patience, precision, an absolute focus on the task at hand, a capacity to remain calm under pressure, translated directly into the operating room. His hands were steady and sure. His spatial intelligence, which had always been strong, made him naturally gifted at the three-dimensional problem-solving that surgery required. His attending physicians noted early that he had an unusual ability to remain completely present during long and difficult procedures, to sustain the quality of his attention without the drift toward fatigue that affected even experienced surgeons. But surgery was never, for Connors, an end in itself. It was rather a means of understanding the human body from the inside, and a daily reminder of why the research he intended to pursue mattered. Every patient who came through the operating room was a lesson in what the body could and could not repair on its own. Every injury, every disease, every case of damage to tissue that medicine could stabilize but not restore, deepened his sense of purpose and sharpened his understanding of the specific problem he intended to spend his career solving. He was not a cold observer of suffering. He felt with genuine intensity the weight of each case, the person behind the diagnosis, the life that would be shaped by the outcome of what happened in that room. But he had learned to hold that feeling in a way that informed rather than overwhelmed his work, to let it motivate without letting it destabilize. It was in his second year of medical school that he began to articulate in writing the research program that would define his career. His early papers, circulated first among faculty advisors and then submitted to journals with increasing confidence, proposed a framework for understanding reptilian limb regeneration at the genetic and biochemical level, and outlined what he believed would be necessary to adapt this framework for application to human tissue. The papers were careful and well argued, grounded in the existing literature while clearly reaching beyond it, and they attracted attention of a particular kind, the attention of people who recognized serious scientific thinking even when, perhaps especially when, it was pointed in a direction that most of the field had not yet considered worth exploring. There was skepticism. There was always skepticism in science as in everything else, and Connors understood that skepticism was not only inevitable but healthy, that the appropriate response to an ambitious hypothesis was not wounded pride but better evidence. Some of his colleagues found his central premise, that the biochemical mechanisms of reptilian regeneration could be sufficiently understood and sufficiently modified to function in human tissue, to be too speculative, too distant from established science to merit serious investment of time and resources. They said so, sometimes gently, and sometimes less so, and Connors listened to their objections with genuine attention, incorporated the valid ones into his thinking, and continued working. What sustained him through the skepticism and through the long, difficult stretches of training when research had to be subordinated to clinical demands was his absolute conviction that the question he was pursuing was the right one. Not the most fashionable question, not the one most likely to produce quick results or easy publications, but the right one, the one that, if answered, would change in a meaningful and lasting way the lives of people who were suffering. This conviction was not arrogance. It did not make him dismissive of other research or contemptuous of other approaches. It was simply the quiet, persistent certainty of a man who had been thinking about a problem since childhood and who had not yet encountered a reason to believe he was thinking about the wrong problem. It was during his final year of medical school that Curt Connors met Martha. She was a graduate student in biochemistry, a woman of formidable intelligence and equally formidable practicality, someone who had an unusual gift for cutting through the elaborate scaffolding that complicated scientific arguments sometimes erect around relatively simple questions, and identifying the essential point with a speed and clarity that Connors found immediately impressive and, in an entirely unexpected way, deeply attractive. She was also funny, with a dry and precise sense of humour that appealed to his own more understated sensibility, and she was kind, in the specific way that intelligent people are kind when they have also chosen to be, when kindness is a considered value rather than a reflexive habit. Their first real conversation took place in the university library, in the section devoted to cellular biology, where they had both arrived independently in search of the same journal. The minor comedy of this situation, two people reaching for the same volume at the same moment, and then finding in the subsequent slightly awkward exchange that they were interested in different articles within it, but for reasons that turned out to be surprisingly related, became a story they would tell for years with great pleasure. Martha had been working on a paper about the biochemistry of cellular repair mechanisms. Connors had been looking for the same journal because it contained a study on salamander limb regeneration that he had been meaning to read for weeks. They stood in the library aisle for 45 minutes, talking about the relationship between these two things, and by the end of the conversation, each of them had a fairly clear sense that something significant had just begun. Martha understood his work in a way that most people in his life, even the scientifically trained ones, did not quite manage. She understood it not merely intellectually, as a set of interesting problems, but practically, as a research program that would require specific kinds of support and specific kinds of patience from the people around him. She understood that it would be slow. She understood that there would be years when progress was invisible to anyone outside the laboratory. She understood that the goal was distant and uncertain, and she chose, with her eyes open, to walk toward it alongside him. They married shortly after completing their respective degrees, in a small ceremony attended by family and the handful of close friends that two people who had spent most of their adult lives in libraries and laboratories tend to accumulate. It was not an elaborate event, and neither of them wanted it to be. What they wanted was simply to begin the life they had decided to build together. And the ceremony was the formal acknowledgement of a decision that had already been made in quieter and more private moments. The years that followed their marriage were years of residency and early research positions, of modest apartments and long hours and the gradual, painstaking establishment of a scientific reputation built one careful paper at a time. Billy arrived during this period, in the first years of their marriage, and his arrival changed everything and nothing at once, the way the arrival of a child always does. It did not change Connor's research direction or his commitment to his work, but it changed the emotional register in which that work was conducted. He had always wanted to help people who had lost limbs. Now he had a son, and the thought of his son losing something irreplaceable, the thought of any parent watching their child face that kind of permanent loss, gave the abstraction of his research a new and very immediate weight. Billy was a healthy, curious, cheerful child who looked at the world with an openness that his father found both delightful and humbling. He was interested in everything, in the way that small children are before the world begins to sort them into categories, and he was particularly interested in whatever his father happened to be doing at any given moment. The first time Connors brought him into a laboratory, Billy was 4 years old, and he stood very still in the middle of the room, looking around at the equipment and the specimens and the particular organized complexity of a space devoted to serious scientific work, and then he looked up at his father and said with great solemnity, "There are a lot of things in here." Connors had laughed genuinely and freely in the way he laughed with his family that he rarely laughed anywhere else, and had agreed that yes, there were a great many things, and that he would explain all of them eventually. That promise, made to a 4-year-old in a university laboratory, was one that Connors intended to keep. He carried it with him as he continued his research, as he prepared the papers and applied for the grants, and made the plans that would eventually take his family south to Florida, where the warm, wet climate and the abundance of the specific reptilian species he needed for his work offered conditions he could not find anywhere else. He was moving toward the most important work of his career, and he was moving toward it as the person he had spent his whole life becoming: a careful scientist, a devoted husband, a father who had promised his son that he would explain everything. It was a promise made in good faith by a good man who could not yet know what explaining everything would eventually require him to say. The life that Curtis and Martha Connors had built together in those early years had a quality of quiet rightness to it, the sense of two people moving in a direction that suited them, toward work that mattered, and a future they had chosen with clear eyes. It was not a life without difficulty. The financial pressures of early academic careers, the long hours of research that yielded progress in increments too small to celebrate, the ordinary challenges of raising a young child while both parents were deeply committed to demanding professional work, all of these were real and sometimes wearing. But they were the difficulties of a life that was fundamentally on course, and both Connors and Martha understood the difference between that kind of difficulty and the kind that signals something has gone wrong. What came next was the kind that signals something has gone wrong. Not gradually, not with warning signs that a careful person might have noticed and prepared for, but with the sudden, complete irreversibility that characterizes the moments that divide a life into before and after. The specific details of Connors' military service, the branch, the theatre of operations, the particular conflict that called him away from his laboratory and his family, belong to the kind of history that the Marvel universe renders in broad strokes rather than precise detail, but the essential facts are clear enough. He was called to serve as a battlefield surgeon, and he went. This was not a decision made lightly or without full understanding of what it would cost. He and Martha spent long evenings talking through what his service would mean, for her, for Billy, for the research that was at a critical stage of development. But Connors had grown up in a household that understood obligation, and the obligation to use his surgical skills in service of people who would otherwise have no access to them in a combat environment was one he could not in good conscience decline. He was good at it. The qualities that had made him an exceptional surgeon in a hospital setting, his steadiness, his focus, his capacity to remain present and functional under conditions of extreme pressure, translated to the battlefield context with a directness that surprised even him. The operating conditions were nothing like the clean and well-resourced environments of the hospitals where he had trained. The equipment was often inadequate, the lighting poor, the noise and chaos of an active combat zone, a constant presence just beyond the walls of whatever structure had been commandeered as a surgical facility. But Connors worked in these conditions with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and he saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, and he understood that this was what he was there to do and that it mattered. He wrote to Martha as often as he could, letters that described the work in careful terms, that asked about Billy's progress in the particular developmental stages that a father who has read everything available on child development finds himself tracking with perhaps excessive attention, that expressed the love and the missing in language that was more direct and less guarded than Connors tended to be in person. Martha kept every letter. Billy, who was still very young and could not fully understand where his father was or why, was told that his father was helping people who were hurt, which was true, and which seemed to satisfy him in the way that simple and accurate explanations tend to satisfy young children who have not yet learned to distrust simplicity. The day of the injury began like many other days in that environment, which is to say that it began in controlled tension, the baseline condition of a surgical unit operating in proximity to active conflict. There had been casualties during the night, and the morning brought more, and Connors had been in the operating room for most of the preceding 12 hours by the time the situation changed. What happened in the specific moments of the injury has been described in various ways across the years, but the essential shape of it is consistent. A soldier was brought in requiring immediate surgical intervention, the kind of intervention that could not wait, and that Connors was in the best position to provide. He was performing that surgery when the facility came under attack. The details of what followed are not the important thing. The important thing, the thing that would matter for the rest of Connors' life and for every life his story touched afterward, is simply this. He did not stop operating. The sounds of the attack, the structural damage to the building around him, the organised chaos of military personnel responding to the situation, none of it caused him to step back from the table. He finished what he had started because the person on the table needed him to finish it, and because stopping was not something his understanding of his own obligations allowed him to do. He saved the soldier's life, and in the process, he lost his arm. The injury was caused by falling debris, structural material brought down by the force of the attack, which struck his right arm with enough force and at such an angle as to cause damage that the medical personnel who treated him in the immediate aftermath could not repair. The arm was amputated above the elbow. He was unconscious when this happened, having lost consciousness in the moments after the debris struck, and when he woke he was in a medical facility some distance from where he had been, and Martha had been notified, and the world had already reorganized itself around an absence that he had not yet had the chance to feel. The first days of awareness after an injury of that magnitude are not, by most accounts, the days of sharpest grief. The body and the mind are occupied with the immediate business of survival, with the processing of pain and medication, and the basic orienting work of understanding where one is and what has happened. Connors experienced this disorientation in its full form, moving in and out of clarity as his body worked through the shock of what it had sustained, registering the absence of his arm in the fragmentary, unreliable way that the heavily medicated mind registers new information, knowing it without quite yet feeling it. The feeling came later. It came in the quiet hours, in the particular stillness of a medical ward at 3 a.m. when the other patients were sleeping, and the nursing staff moved softly between beds, and the mind had nothing to occupy it except the truth. He would reach for something in the darkness, some small automatic gesture that the body makes without consulting the conscious mind, and find nothing there, and the nothing would be not merely physical but existential, a gap in the world that corresponded to a gap in himself, in the surgeon who needed 2 hands to do the work that gave his life its deepest sense of purpose. He was a man who had built his identity around the precision of his hands. The careful, dexterous, surgically trained hands that could close a wound or repair a blood vessel, with movements so practiced and so controlled that they had ceased to feel like actions and had become instead something closer to thought, the body simply enacting what the mind intended without the friction of conscious effort. The right hand, the one that was gone, had been dominant. It had been, in a real and not merely metaphorical sense, the primary instrument through which he had expressed his deepest professional purpose, and it was gone, and there was no equivalent loss in his vocabulary of experience that could have prepared him for what that meant. Martha arrived as soon as she was able, leaving Billy in the care of her parents and travelling to be with her husband in the facility where he was recovering. The reunion between them was not the kind of moment that resolves grief or transforms it into something manageable. It was simply the moment when the person who loved him most was present, which was what he needed, and which was what she provided, and which was, in the specific emotional economy of a marriage like theirs, more valuable than any words or gestures that might have accompanied it. She sat beside his bed, and she held the hand that remained, and they did not talk very much for the first day or two, because there was not yet language adequate to what had happened. What Martha understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that was one of the great strengths of her character, was that the grief of the immediate period was not the most difficult thing they would face. The most difficult thing would come later, when the shock had faded and the rehabilitation had begun, and the daily reality of a life permanently altered had to be negotiated in all its ordinary, relentless detail. She was right about this, as she was right about most things she turned her attention to, and she began, quietly and without announcement, to prepare herself for that longer and more demanding work. The rehabilitation process was exactly as difficult as both of them had known it would be. Connors approached it with his characteristic discipline, doing what the therapist asked of him, attending every session, pushing through the discomfort and frustration of relearning movements and adaptations that his body had not previously needed to know. He was not a difficult patient in the conventional sense. He did not rail against his situation or refuse to cooperate with the process. But those who worked with him during this period noted a quality of contained grief in everything he did, a heaviness that was not self-pity but something more considered and more permanent, the weight of a man reckoning with a loss that he understood completely and could not minimize. He thought about his research constantly during this period, in the sleepless hours of the night and in the long stretches of therapy, and in the quieter moments when Martha was sitting with him, and conversation had given way to companionable silence. His mind returned again and again to the work he had left behind in the laboratory, to the papers and specimens and carefully documented protocols that were waiting for him, to the central question that had organized his intellectual life since childhood. The question had not changed. If anything, it had grown sharper and more urgent. He was now, personally and undeniably, a person who had lost a limb. He was now, in a way he had not been before, inside the problem he had spent his career trying to solve. This realization, which came to him gradually over the weeks of his recovery, was not a comfortable one. It contained an element of terrible irony that he allowed himself to acknowledge without dwelling on it. The recognition that the scientist who had devoted himself to understanding regeneration had become a person who needed it. But it also contained something else, something quieter and more sustaining. It clarified his purpose in a way that no amount of abstract commitment to helping others had quite managed to do. He was no longer working toward a solution for a category of people whose suffering he had observed from outside. He was working toward a solution that he and everyone like him needed, and the personal weight of that need became, in time, not a source of despair, but a source of determination so steady and so deep that it would carry him through everything that was still to come. When he was well enough to travel, they went home. Billy, who was brought to meet his father with the careful preparation of a child who's been told something important and is doing his best to understand it, approached the reunion with a seriousness that broke and healed Connor's heart in the same moment. The boy looked at his father for a long moment, taking in the absence that the adults in his life had tried to explain in age-appropriate terms, and then he climbed carefully into his father's lap, on the side where the arm was, and settled there with the complete trust of a small child who has decided that the person holding him is still the same person, regardless of what is different, and that being held is what matters. Connors held his son with the one arm he had, and looked over the boy's head at Martha, and felt the particular quality of a grief that is also, in its way, a form of gratitude. He was alive. His family was intact. The work was waiting for him, and somewhere in the cellular machinery of the natural world, in the biology of creatures that had been perfecting their particular solutions to the problem of loss and restoration for longer than human science had existed to ask questions about it, the answer he had been looking for was still there, patient and unchanging, waiting to be found. He would find it. He had decided this not in the dramatic register of a vow made in a moment of crisis, but in the quiet, definitive way that a person of his temperament made the decisions that mattered most to him, simply, clearly, and with the full understanding that it would take a very long time. He would find it, and when he did, no one else would have to lose what he had lost and live with the permanent arithmetic of that subtraction. That was the plan. That was, in its quiet and determined way, the promise he made to himself and to his family, and to everyone who had ever reached in the darkness for something that was no longer there. He picked up his pen, his left hand learning its new responsibilities, with the patience of a man who understood that some things simply take the time they take, and he opened his notebook, and he began again. The decision to move to Florida was not made quickly, and it was not made without the careful weighing of everything it would cost, and everything it might provide. Connors had spent months after his return home rebuilding the rhythms of his professional life, adapting his surgical work where adaptation was possible, redirecting his energies toward research in the areas where his physical limitations had changed what was available to him. He was not a man who indulged in self-pity, but he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the landscape of his career had shifted, and that the most useful response to that shift was not to pretend otherwise, but to look clearly at where the new terrain offered the best ground to work from. The answer, when he looked clearly, was Florida. Specifically, the subtropical wetlands of the southern part of the state, where the ecosystem supported a density and diversity of reptilian life that no other region of the continental United States could match. The species he needed for his research, the particular lizards and salamanders whose regenerative biology he had been studying for years, were present there in abundance, available for careful, ethical, properly supervised research in conditions that would have been impossible to replicate in a northern university laboratory. The climate was warm and wet in a way that supported the kind of long, uninterrupted research seasons that his work required. And there were university affiliations available, research positions that would give him institutional support and access to resources, while also allowing him the independence his particular project demanded. Martha, characteristically, had assessed the situation with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, and had arrived at the same conclusion through her own reasoning before he had finished making his case to her. Billy, who was by this time old enough to have opinions about things and young enough to find the prospect of moving to a place with alligators fundamentally exciting, offered no objections, and so the Connors family packed the contents of their modest northern life into a moving truck and drove south. Through the gradual warming of the landscape, through the flattening of the terrain and the thickening of the vegetation, and the particular quality of light that belongs to a part of the world where the sun has more authority than it does further north, their new home was a modest house on the outskirts of a small community not far from the research facility where Connors had arranged his position. It was a comfortable house, unpretentious in the way that suited both of them, with a yard that backed up against a stretch of undeveloped land where the native vegetation grew in the lush, slightly chaotic abundance of a subtropical ecosystem left largely to its own devices. Billy claimed this yard with the proprietary enthusiasm of a child encountering a new and richly populated natural world, and within his first week had already catalogued, in a composition notebook that Connors recognised with a private and complicated feeling, at least 11 species of lizard that visited the garden on a regular basis. The laboratory was a short drive from the house, situated at the edge of a research complex that occupied a cleared area between a secondary road and the beginning of the wetlands proper. The building itself was not impressive from the outside, a low, functional structure of the kind that institutions build when they are more interested in what happens inside a building than in how the building presents itself to the world. But the interior was what mattered, and the interior was for Connors close to ideal. There was space for his specimens, proper refrigeration for his tissue cultures, a chemical analysis setup that was adequate for his current needs, and above all, the particular quality of quiet that serious research requires, the sense that the world outside was not pressing urgently against the walls. That time here moved at a pace conducive to careful thought. He spent the first week simply settling in, learning the rhythms of the new environment, establishing the protocols and organizational systems that would govern the laboratory's daily operation. He was methodical about this in the way he was methodical about everything, understanding that the quality of the infrastructure he built at the beginning of a research program would determine the quality of the work it could support over the years that followed. He labelled and catalogued and organised with patient attention, setting up his specimen tanks and his tissue culture apparatus and his documentation systems with the thoroughness of a man who intended to be working in this space for a very long time. The wetlands themselves became, almost immediately, an essential part of his daily life, in a way that went beyond their scientific utility. He had grown up in the natural world of Pennsylvania, with its deciduous forests and its rocky streams and its particular northern quality of light and season, and he had loved that landscape with the uncomplicated affection of a child who does not yet know enough to choose his attachments. But the Florida wetlands offered him something different, something that took longer to understand and proved, in time, more deeply sustaining. They offered him a world of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary patience, a world that had been working through its own problems of survival and adaptation and regeneration for longer than any human institution had existed, and that had arrived at solutions of breathtaking elegance without any assistance from the species that was now, in the form of Curtis Connors, trying to learn from them. In the early mornings, before the heat of the day had fully established itself, he would sometimes walk along the edge of the wetlands, not with any scientific purpose, but simply to be present in that environment, to let the particular quality of the place do whatever it did to his thinking. The cypress trees stood in the still water with the serene permanence of things that have been standing in the same water for a very long time, and have no particular intention of stopping. Their knees rose from the surface in strange sculptural shapes, and the water around them held the reflection of the sky in a way that made it difficult, at certain angles and in certain lights, to tell which was the real sky and which was the image of it. Herons moved through the shallows with a patience that seemed almost contemplative, each step placed with a care that a surgeon might recognize and respect. The air smelled of water and vegetation, and the particular mineral richness of soil that has been accumulating organic matter for centuries. It was in this landscape that Connors found, or perhaps rediscovered, the quality of attention that his research most required. The Everglades and the wetland systems associated with them operated on a timescale that dwarfed human impatience, and spending time in them had a way of recalibrating one's sense of what was urgent and what could wait, of what constituted meaningful progress and what was simply noise. He returned from these morning walks to his laboratory with a steadiness of mind that the work rewarded, settling into the day's tasks with the calm of a man who has been reminded by something larger and older than himself that careful work done over sufficient time tends to produce results that hurried work cannot. The specimens that populated his laboratory during these early Florida years were collected with scrupulous attention to ethical research protocols, in quantities and by methods that were consistent with the welfare of the local populations and with the standards of the institutional review processes that governed his work. The lizards were housed in environments designed to replicate their natural conditions as closely as the laboratory setting allowed, with appropriate temperature gradients and humidity levels, and the kind of spatial complexity that allowed them to behave in ways consistent with their natural repertoire. Connors observed them with the same attention he had given to the skink in his Pennsylvania garden 30 years earlier, watching the regenerative processes he was studying in their natural, unhurried biological expression, letting the animals teach him what the textbooks could only approximate. The specific species that had become central to his research were remarkable in ways that sustained his fascination across years of close observation. The capacity for tail regeneration that had first captured his attention as a child was only the most visible expression of a cellular biology that was, at its deeper levels, doing something extraordinary, something that mammalian biology, including human biology, had largely abandoned in the course of evolutionary history in favour of other strategies for dealing with injury and loss. Understanding why lizards had retained this capacity, what genetic and biochemical mechanisms it depended on, and whether those mechanisms could be reactivated in species that had lost them was the central question of his research, and the Florida specimens gave him access to that question, in a directness and richness that no laboratory animal colony maintained elsewhere could have provided. The notebooks that accumulated on the shelves of his laboratory during this period were dense with observations, measurements, and the kind of careful speculative thinking that serious science depends on, the reaching beyond what the data currently shows toward what it might mean and what it might suggest about what to look for next. His handwriting had changed since the injury, his left hand having developed through years of practice and necessity, a competence that was not quite the same as his right hand's trained precision, but was entirely adequate for the work of documentation. He filled these notebooks with the patient regularity of a man who understood that the record of his thinking was as important as the thinking itself, that science done in private and kept in private was not fully science at all. Martha had established her own professional work in the Florida context, consulting with several research institutions in the area on projects that touched on her biochemistry expertise, and she brought to their evening conversations an outside perspective on his work that Connors found invaluable. She had always been his best intellectual interlocutor, the person most capable of identifying the assumptions he was making without realizing he was making them, of asking the question that reframed a problem in a way that suddenly made a new approach visible. These conversations, conducted over dinner while Billy did his homework at the kitchen table, and the sounds of the wetland evening drifted through the open windows, were among the most productive thinking Connors did during those years, and he was aware of this and grateful for it. Billy's engagement with the laboratory grew as he grew older, moving from the uncomplicated delight of a young child in a room full of interesting things toward something more genuinely curious and more specifically scientific. He was, it became clear, his father's son in the particular way that mattered most to Connors, not necessarily in his specific scientific interests, which were still forming, and which would take their own shape in their own time, but in the quality of his attention, the willingness to look carefully at something for as long as looking carefully required. He would sit beside his father's specimen tanks and watch the lizards with a stillness that Connors recognized from his own childhood, and occasionally he would ask questions that were better than the questions most adults asked, questions that went to the center of the problem rather than circling its edges, One afternoon, when Billy was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, he sat watching one of the specimens that was in the early stages of tail regeneration, and asked his father, without looking up from the tank, why the lizard's body knew to grow a tail back rather than something else. It was, Connors realised as he considered how to answer it, a genuinely important question, one that touched on some of the most fundamental issues in developmental biology, the question of positional information and morphogenetic fields and the mechanisms by which cells know not only that they need to grow, but what they need to become. He pulled a stool up beside his son and sat down, and they talked about it for the better part of an hour. Moving from the specific case of the lizard in the tank to the general principles of biological self-organization, to the particular mystery of how a body holds the information about its own correct form and uses that information to repair damage. It was one of the conversations Connors returned to in memory for a long time afterward, not because of anything scientifically novel that had been said, but because of the quality of attention that both of them had brought to it. The father and the son sitting together in the warm, chemical-scented air of the laboratory, while the Florida afternoon moved slowly through its paces outside, thinking carefully about a question that mattered. It was, in its way, a version of what he'd been doing since he was 9 years old in a Pennsylvania garden, and the continuity of it, the sense that the boy he had been, and the man he had become, and the son he was raising, were all engaged in the same essential act of careful, loving attention to the natural world gave him a feeling of rightness and purpose that sustained him through the long and sometimes discouraging work of the years to come. The laboratory at the end of a working day had a particular quality that Connors had come to love. The specimens settled into their evening routines, the equipment hummed its quiet background note, the notebook sat open on his desk with the day's observations recorded in the careful hand he had trained his left side to produce, and through the window the light over the wetlands shifted through the warm registers of late afternoon toward the deeper colours of evening. He would sit for a few minutes at the end of each day in this quality of light and silence, not reviewing what had been accomplished or planning what came next, but simply being present in the place where his work lived, letting the accumulation of years of patient effort settle around him like the sediment that accumulates in still water, layer upon layer, building something that would eventually be solid enough to stand on. He was building something. He had been building it for a long time, and he would continue building it for years more before it was ready. But in those evening moments in the Florida laboratory, with the wetlands going quiet outside and the day's work documented, and his family waiting for him at home, he felt the truth of what he was doing with a clarity that the difficulties of the work sometimes obscured. He was, in the most literal and most serious sense of the words, trying to give people back what they had lost. He was trying to give himself back what he had lost. And the natural world around him, ancient and patient and continuously, quietly, restoring itself, was showing him the way. The work that filled the years in the Florida laboratory was not the kind of work that announces itself in dramatic moments of revelation. It was quieter than that, and slower, and in many ways more demanding precisely because of its quietness and its slowness. Because it required a sustained quality of attention and commitment that the promise of imminent breakthrough might have made easier to maintain, but that had to be maintained instead on the strength of belief alone, on the conviction that the question was worth the time it was taking, and would continue to be worth the time it had not yet taken. Connors understood this about his work in a way that he had understood it theoretically since graduate school, but that the Florida years made fully experiential. Real science, the kind that reaches toward genuinely new understanding rather than the incremental confirmation of what is already largely known, does not move in a straight line from question to answer. It moves in the irregular, sometimes circling, sometimes backtracking way of any journey taken through unmapped territory, where the path forward is determined not by a known route, but by the continuous interpretation of evidence that is itself always incomplete. He had known this intellectually for his entire career. He knew it now in the way that a person knows something they have lived through, which is a different and more complete kind of knowing. The early years of his Florida research were devoted largely to characterization, to the careful, systematic description of the cellular and biochemical processes that underlay the regenerative capacity he was studying. Before he could think seriously about adaptation or application, he needed to understand the mechanism in its native context with a precision that the existing literature had not yet achieved. This meant long periods of observation and measurement, of tissue analysis and genetic sequencing, and the painstaking work of building a picture of what was actually happening at the cellular level when a lizard regrew a lost appendage. A picture detailed enough to support the kind of theoretical modelling that would eventually tell him whether what he was observing could be translated into a different biological context. He was not working in isolation during this period, though the particular focus of his research meant that the community of scientists working on closely related problems was smaller than in more fashionable areas of biological inquiry. He corresponded regularly with researchers at several universities, exchanging data and ideas in the careful, qualified language that scientists use when they are sharing work that is still in progress, still subject to revision, still not ready for the kind of definitive statement that publication requires. These correspondences were among the most intellectually sustaining aspects of his professional life during those years, the experience of thinking alongside other people who were asking related questions from different angles, whose findings sometimes confirmed his own and sometimes challenged them in ways that required him to reconsider assumptions he had not realized he was making. Some of these correspondences grew into genuine collaborative relationships, the kind of professional friendships that are built on mutual respect for the quality of each other's thinking and a shared commitment to getting things right regardless of how long getting things right takes. A researcher at a university in the Northeast, whose work on the genetic regulation of tissue growth had been important to Connor's own thinking for years, became a regular correspondent during this period, and their exchanges, which covered not only the specific technical questions of their shared interests, but also the broader methodological and philosophical questions that serious scientists eventually have to reckon with, helped Connors develop and refine the theoretical framework that was gradually taking shape in his thinking. The framework, as it emerged through these years of research and correspondence and careful documentation, was built around a specific hypothesis about the relationship between genetic regulatory mechanisms and the capacity for regeneration. Connors had come to believe, on the basis of his own experimental work and his reading of the broader literature, that the difference between species that could regenerate lost tissue and those that could not was not primarily a matter of possessing or lacking specific genes, but rather a matter of whether certain genes were actively expressed or had been silenced in the course of evolutionary history. Mammalian genomes, including the human genome, contained sequences that showed clear evolutionary relationship to the genes active in lizard regeneration. The question was not whether humans had the relevant genetic information, but whether that information could be reactivated. This was the hypothesis that organized everything else. It was not a new hypothesis in its most general form. Other researchers had gestured towards similar ideas in the literature, but Connors was pursuing it with a specificity and a biochemical precision that represented a genuine advance on what had been done before. The particular contribution his Florida research was building toward was a detailed enough understanding of the biochemical signals that regulated the expression of the relevant genes in lizards to allow him to design molecules that might produce analogous signals in mammalian tissue. This was the bridge he was trying to build between what the lizards did naturally and what a carefully designed biochemical intervention might be able to do in a human body. The progress toward this goal was real, but it was measured in the small increments of careful science, in experiments whose results narrowed the range of possibilities, rather than pointing definitively to a single answer, in the gradual accumulation of data that was building piece by piece toward the evidentiary foundation that a serious clinical hypothesis required. There were experiments that failed, in the sense that they did not produce the results that the theoretical framework predicted, and these failures required the kind of honest reckoning that distinguishes good science from wishful thinking. Connors was good at this reckoning. He had, from the beginning of his career, understood that a failed experiment is not a defeat, but information, that the gap between what you expected and what you found is precisely the place where understanding advances, if you're willing to look at it clearly rather than explaining it away. Martha's role in this period of the research was considerable, and not always fully visible in the formal record of the work. She was not a co-author on the papers that Connors published during these years, because her contribution was of a kind that did not fit neatly into the conventions of scientific authorship, but its value was real, and Connors knew it. She was the person who read every draft of every paper before it was submitted, who asked the questions that the reviewers would ask and identified the arguments that needed strengthening before they encountered external scrutiny. She was the person who noticed in the course of one of their evening conversations a potential flaw in the experimental design of a study that was already underway, a flaw that Connors, too close to the work to see it clearly, had missed entirely, and whose identification saved him months of work that would otherwise have produced results too compromised to be useful. She also managed, with the quiet efficiency that characterized her approach to most practical problems, the considerable organizational and logistical demands of a research program that was operating on a limited budget with a small team. Connors was not indifferent to these matters, but his attention was most naturally directed toward the intellectual content of the work, and Martha's ability to hold the operational dimensions of the program together freed him to sustain that intellectual focus without the constant distraction of administrative complexity. It was a division of labor that suited both of them, and that both of them understood, without needing to discuss it explicitly, as one of the ways their particular partnership worked. The institutional relationships that supported the laboratory during this period were a source of both assistance and occasional friction. The university affiliation that provided Connors with his formal position also provided him with access to resources and infrastructure that his research required. But it also meant that his work existed within an institutional context that had its own priorities and its own timelines and its own sense of what constituted promising research worth supporting. There were periods when the pace of his progress and the unconventional direction of his inquiry made it difficult to secure the continued support of administrators whose confidence in long-term, exploratory research was limited by the pressures of short-term funding cycles and the need to demonstrate results in terms that institutional review committees could readily understand and evaluate. He navigated these pressures with the same patient steadiness he brought to the scientific difficulties of the work, making the case for his research in terms that emphasized its potential applications, without overstating the proximity of those applications to the current state of the evidence. He was careful, in these institutional conversations, to be honest about where the work stood and what it would require to advance, understanding that the credibility of his program depended on the accuracy of his representations, and that credibility, once lost, was very difficult to recover. Some administrators found his caution frustrating, preferring the more confident projections that other researchers sometimes offered and that institutional funders sometimes rewarded. Connors offered what he honestly believed, and let the quality of the work make the case that exaggeration would have made more easily but less durably. Beyond the university, his work had begun to attract attention from a broader range of institutions and interests. The pharmaceutical industry had obvious potential interest in a technology that could stimulate tissue regeneration in human patients, and Connors received inquiries from several companies during this period. Expressions of interest that range from the genuinely collaborative to the transparently acquisitive, from organizations that wanted to support the research because they believed in its scientific value, to organizations that wanted access to whatever it might eventually produce and were less interested in the process by which it got there. He engaged with all of these inquiries carefully, accepting support where it came without conditions that would compromise the integrity of the research, and declining where the conditions attached were ones he could not accept in good conscience. There was contact during this period with the broader network of scientific institutions that populated the Marvel Universe's particular version of the research world. The name of Oscorp appeared in correspondence, as it appeared in many conversations about the intersection of cutting-edge biological research and the corporate interests that sometimes sought to shape it. Empire State University, where Connors would eventually hold a teaching position, was represented among the institutions that expressed interest in his work. The government research bodies that maintained oversight of scientific programs with potential military or public health applications were also occasionally in touch, though their interest was of a different character, more concerned with monitoring and understanding than with active collaboration. Connors held all of these relationships at a careful distance that was not unfriendliness but professional self-preservation, the understanding that the work required a certain insulation from external pressures and agendas if it was going to remain what it needed to remain, which was honest, careful, and guided by the evidence rather than by the expectations of the people who were watching and waiting for it to produce something they could use. He was not naive about the world in which his research existed, about the commercial and institutional and governmental interests that surrounded it, and would eventually, if he was successful, seek to shape its application. But he maintained, throughout this period, a clear sense of the difference between the world in which the research existed and the laboratory in which it was conducted, and he protected the laboratory from the world with the same steady attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. The formula, as it began to take meaningful shape in the later years of this period, was the product of all of this work, the years of observation and characterization, and theoretical development and experimental refinement, consolidated into a specific biochemical design that represented Connors' best current understanding of what a functional regenerative agent for human tissue would need to do, and how it might be made to do it. It was not yet a finished formula. It was a working hypothesis in molecular form, something that the theory predicted should function, and that the preliminary experimental evidence suggested might be on the right track. But that had not yet been tested in the ways that would be necessary to know with any confidence whether it would do what he hoped it would do. He knew, with the honesty that had always governed his relationship with his own work, that he was still some distance from the point at which responsible clinical testing could begin. The animal studies that would precede any human application were not yet complete. The safety profile of the compound was not yet characterized with sufficient detail to support confidence about its behavior in a living system more complex than the tissue culture preparations he had been working with. The theoretical framework was solid, the preliminary data was encouraging, but the gap between encouraging and proven was one that responsible science could not leap across without the careful, methodical work of filling it in. He documented all of this in his notebooks with the same scrupulous honesty he brought to everything, recording not only the promising results, but the uncertainties and the gaps and the questions that remained open. He wrote letters to his correspondents that gave an accurate picture of where the work stood, that shared the genuine excitement of real progress without inflating it into a confidence that the evidence did not yet support. He discussed it with Martha in their evening conversations, thinking aloud about what the next phase of testing would require and what the timeline might realistically look like, and what it would mean if the results continued in the direction they had been going for the people who needed what he was working toward. He was, in these conversations, beginning to talk about himself among those people. Not dramatically, not with the particular weight of personal suffering, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had long ago accepted the terms of his own situation, and was now, for the first time, allowing himself to consider that those terms might be negotiable. He had lived for years with the absence of his arm as a fixed condition, something to be adapted to and worked around rather than reversed. The formula, as it developed, was changing his relationship to that fixity, introducing into the settled landscape of his acceptance the possibility of something he had trained himself not to hope for too specifically. It was a delicate thing, that hope. He held it carefully, the way he held all the most important things in his life, with full attention and without pressure, allowing it to be what it was without demanding that it become something more. The work would tell him what the work could do. He would follow it honestly wherever it led, and he would not ask it to lead somewhere it was not yet ready to go. The notebooks accumulated on the shelves of the laboratory, and the formula took shape in increments too small to celebrate individually but too significant, in their accumulation, to dismiss. The wetlands outside the window continued their ancient patient work of sustaining and renewing and restoring themselves, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in the low building at their edge, but offering, to anyone willing to look at them with the right quality of attention, a continuous demonstration of what patient, faithful biological work could eventually produce. Connors looked at them every evening before he locked the laboratory and drove home. He had been looking at them for years, and they had not yet stopped teaching him something. There is a particular kind of threshold that a scientist reaches after years of careful work, a point at which the accumulated evidence has built to a level where the next step becomes not merely imaginable, but, in some deep and difficult to articulate sense, inevitable. It is not the same as certainty. A rigorous scientific mind does not confuse the two, and Connors had spent enough years developing the habit of rigorous thinking to be very clear about the difference between what the data showed and what he hoped the data showed. But there is a quality of readiness that accumulates alongside the evidence, a sense that the work has arrived at a juncture where continuing to wait is no longer simply caution, but something closer to avoidance, and that the honest acknowledgement of where the research actually stood required him to reckon with what came next. What came next, in the formal language of clinical research, was animal testing. This was the established pathway, the protocol that responsible science had developed over generations of hard experience, with the consequences of moving too quickly from laboratory hypothesis to human application. Connors knew this pathway as well as anyone. He had taught it to students, had written about it in papers that discussed the ethics of research methodology, had applied it rigorously in the earlier phases of his own work. The animal studies that preceded any consideration of human application were not a bureaucratic formality, but a genuine scientific necessity. A way of learning things about the behavior of a compound in a living system that no amount of tissue culture work or theoretical modeling could reveal. He had been conducting these studies. The results, accumulated over the preceding months with the same careful documentation that characterized every phase of the research, were encouraging in a way that the earlier phases of the work had not quite been, encouraging in the specific, precise sense that the compound was doing, in the animal models, something recognizably related to what the theory predicted it should do. The regenerative processes it was stimulating were not identical to the natural lizard regeneration that had inspired the research. They were a translation rather than a direct replication, mediated by the particular biochemistry of the mammalian systems in which the compound was now operating. But they were unmistakably in the same family of biological events, and the tissue being generated was functional tissue. Not merely scar formation or undifferentiated growth, but something that was beginning, in the most promising subjects, to look and behave like the tissue it was replacing. There were also results that required more careful interpretation. The compound's behavior was not entirely predictable across all subjects. There was a range of responses that the theoretical framework had not fully anticipated, and some of these responses raised questions that he was still in the process of answering. The questions were not, in his assessment, disqualifying. They were the kind of complexity that any genuinely novel biological intervention would be expected to generate, and they were the kind of complexity that further careful study could address. But they were real, and he documented them honestly, and he thought about them in the long evenings after the laboratory was quiet, and the day's results were recorded, and there was nothing to do but think. It was in this context, with the animal studies producing results that were genuinely promising but not yet complete, with the safety profile of the compound characterized but not fully, with the theoretical framework solid, but the empirical foundation still carrying uncertainties that responsible science would want to resolve before moving forward, that Connors began to seriously consider what he had been considering, in a less focused and more easily set-aside way, for much longer than he was entirely comfortable admitting to himself. The consideration was simple in its surface form and enormously complex in everything beneath that surface. He had a compound that the evidence suggested might be capable of stimulating limb regeneration in mammals. He had, in the form of his own body, an obvious potential subject for such a compound. The question of whether to test it on himself was one that he had been circling for months, without quite allowing himself to look at directly, understanding that looking at it directly would require him to think through all of its implications in a way that circling it allowed him to avoid. He thought through all of its implications now. He was not a person who made important decisions by looking away from their full complexity, and this decision, whatever he ultimately made of it, deserved the same honest attention he gave to everything that mattered. He began with the case against, because the case against was the one that his scientific training most readily supplied, and that professional conscience most clearly supported. Self-experimentation was not a respected practice in contemporary medical research, and it was not disrespected without reason. The history of science contained examples of researchers who had tested compounds or procedures on themselves and had suffered consequences that ranged from the unfortunate to the catastrophic, and the ethical frameworks that governed modern research had been developed in part as a response to the recognition that the desire to advance one's own work could compromise the judgment of even the most careful and well-intentioned scientist. The conflict of interest involved in being simultaneously the researcher designing an experiment and the subject experiencing its effects was obvious and serious. The absence of objective external oversight in a self-experiment was a genuine methodological problem, not merely a procedural one. Beyond the methodological concerns, the safety profile of the compound, while not alarming in the animal studies, was not yet fully characterized. There were aspects of its behavior that he understood well, and aspects that he understood less well, and the aspects he understood less well were precisely the aspects that could not be fully understood until the compound was tested in a living system more complex than the ones he'd been working with. Testing it in himself before those questions were answered was not merely bending the rules of careful research, but accepting a degree of personal risk that was difficult to justify on purely scientific grounds. He wrote all of this down. He'd found, over the years, that the discipline of writing through a problem rather than simply thinking through it had a clarifying effect, that the act of committing a line of reasoning to paper forced a specificity and an honesty that interior monologue could more easily evade. He wrote the case against in careful, complete sentences, giving it full weight, not allowing the pull of the case for to soften the force of its objections prematurely. Then he wrote the case for, with the same honesty and the same care. The compound had performed in the animal models in ways that his theoretical framework predicted. The safety profile, while not complete, contained no findings that suggested acute danger to a human subject in the short term. He was a trained physician with deep familiarity with the compound and its expected mechanisms of action, which meant that he was better positioned than any other potential human subject to monitor his own response and to recognize and respond to unexpected developments. He would not be conducting the experiment in ignorance or without preparation. He would be conducting it with the most detailed possible knowledge of what the compound was designed to do and with the clinical training to assess what it was actually doing. And then there was the part of the case for that was not strictly scientific, the part that he wrote last because it required the most honesty, and because honesty about this particular thing was the most difficult kind. He had been living for years with the absence of his arm. He had adapted to it, had built a productive and meaningful professional life around it, had refused to allow it to become the defining fact of his existence. But the adaptation had cost something. That adaptation always costs. A continuous low-level expenditure of effort and attention in the management of a loss that did not diminish with time in the way that some losses do. He missed the use of his arm with a specificity and a constancy that he did not discuss because there was nothing useful to say about it. Because the people who loved him knew it without being told, and there was no point in burdening them with a pain they could not relieve. The formula offered the possibility of relief. Not a theoretical possibility in some distant future when all the proper protocols had been fully satisfied, but a real possibility, available now in the laboratory where he worked every day, dependent only on the decision to act. He was aware of how much this awareness was capable of distorting his judgment, aware that the personal stake he had in the outcome was precisely the kind of factor that the protocols against self-experimentation were designed to guard against. He wrote this awareness into his notes explicitly, naming the conflict of interest in plain language, refusing to pretend that it was not there or that it was not influencing his thinking. He spoke with Martha. This was not a conversation he had been avoiding exactly, but it was one he had been approaching slowly, allowing her to see the direction his thinking was moving before articulating it directly, giving her time to form her own view without the pressure of a formal request for her response. She had seen the direction, because Martha always saw the direction, and when he finally laid out the full shape of what he was considering, she received it not with surprise, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she had already been thinking about carefully. Her fear was real, and she did not hide it. She had not spent years married to a man without knowing what his loss cost him, and she did not oppose his desire to address it. But she was afraid of what she did not know, of the uncertainties that the research had not yet resolved, of the specific quality of the unknown that exists at the edge of genuinely new science, the recognition that what you do not know is by definition the thing you cannot anticipate. She said all of this clearly, without drama, in the direct and honest way that characterized her engagement with everything difficult between them. He listened. He always listened to her carefully, and he was listening now with particular attention, because he understood that her fear was not irrational, and that her intelligence in assessing the situation was not inferior to his own. They talked for a long time, over several evenings, circling the question from different angles, neither of them pushing the conversation toward a conclusion before it was ready to arrive there. Billy was asleep in his room during these conversations, and the knowledge of his sleeping presence in the house gave the discussions a particular weight. The understanding that whatever Connors decided would affect not only himself, but the people whose lives were most intimately connected to his. Martha did not forbid him. She would not have used that word, and the relationship between them was not one that operated in those terms. But she made very clear what she needed from him if he was going to proceed, which was that he would document everything, that he would establish clear criteria for stopping, that he would tell her immediately if anything felt wrong in a way that his monitoring protocols did not capture, and that he would not allow the desire for the outcome to override his clinical judgment at any point in the process. These were reasonable conditions, the conditions of a person who was choosing to trust someone with something very important, and needed to know that the trust would be honoured. He agreed to all of them. He agreed to them not as a negotiation but as a genuine commitment, understanding that they were right, and that they made the decision more defensible than it would otherwise have been, that they represented the most responsible version of something that could not be made entirely responsible. The night he chose for the experiment was a quiet one, a weeknight in the middle of the week when the laboratory complex was largely empty, and the wetlands outside were doing what they always did in the evening hours, settling into the particular darkness of a subtropical night, full of sound and life and the ancient biological persistence of creatures that had been regenerating and renewing themselves in that landscape for longer than any human category of time could easily hold. He prepared the compound with the same methodical attention he had given to every phase of the research, checking each step against his documented protocol, verifying the concentration and purity of the preparation, ensuring that the monitoring equipment he had set up to track his vital signs and his biochemical markers was functioning correctly and calibrated to the parameters he had established. He had arranged for the results of this monitoring to be accessible remotely, so that Martha at home could see the data in real time if she chose to. She had chosen to. He knew she was awake, watching the numbers on the screen in the study, and the knowledge of this was not a pressure but a comfort, the sense of being accompanied through something difficult by someone who loved him. He sat at his laboratory bench for a few minutes before proceeding, not in hesitation, but in the deliberate stillness of a person who wants to be fully present in an important moment before it passes into the irreversibility of the past. He looked at his notes, at the years of careful work they represented. He looked at the empty sleeve of his laboratory coat, folded and pinned with the neatness that habit had long since made automatic. He looked through the window at the darkness of the wetlands, where somewhere in the still water and the root systems of the cypress trees, creatures were doing tonight what they had always done, healing themselves, restoring themselves, enacting in the quiet dark the very processes he had spent his career trying to understand. He administered the injection with the clinical precision of a man who had been a surgeon, his left hand steady and sure, the gesture itself unremarkable in its physical execution, the kind of thing he had done thousands of times in clinical contexts, the kind of thing the body did without difficulty once the mind had finished its deliberations and arrived at its decision. Then he sat back and updated his monitoring log with the time and the dosage and the method of administration, and began to wait, with the patience of a man who had been waiting in one way or another for most of his adult life. The first thing he noticed within the first half hour was warmth, a spreading warmth that moved from the site of the injection outward through his body, not unpleasant, not alarming, but distinctly present, and distinctly unlike anything he had felt before. He documented it carefully, noting its character and intensity and the rate at which it spread, keeping his clinical attention engaged and accurate, even as the part of him that was not a clinician felt something that it took him a moment to name correctly. It was hope. The oldest and most specific hope of his adult life, the one he had carried since the moment of waking in a military hospital to find the world permanently rearranged, the one he had transformed into a research program and a career and a daily discipline of patient work. It was present now not as an abstraction but as something physical, something that had the same warmth and the same directional pull as the compound moving through his tissue, the same sense of something beginning to happen that could not be undone. He wrote it down because he wrote everything down, and because this too was data, the emotional state of the subject at the moment of administration, relevant to the complete record of what was occurring. He wrote it in the same careful hand that had filled the notebooks on the shelves behind him, in the same quiet laboratory where years of work had been building toward this moment, and outside the window, the Florida night continued its ancient business, indifferent and patient and alive. He did not sleep that night. This was not because he was in distress, not because the compound was producing effects that alarmed him or demanded his clinical attention in any urgent way, but because the quality of what was happening in his body was too present, too specific and too strange to allow the mind that was monitoring it to release its attention and drift into unconsciousness. He sat at his laboratory bench through the hours of the Florida night, updating his log at regular intervals, tracking the data that his monitoring equipment was producing, and feeling, beneath the discipline of his clinical attention, something that he could not entirely reduce to data, a kind of aliveness in the tissues of his right side that had not been present before, and that the monitoring equipment could register only partially and obliquely. The warmth that had begun in the first half hour after the injection did not subside. It settled into something more sustained and more localized, concentrating in the area of his right shoulder and the residual limb below it, the tissue that the military surgeons had preserved and shaped during his amputation, the biological remnant of what had once been a complete arm. He had lived with this tissue for years, had learned its particular sensory profile, the specific ways it communicated with the rest of his nervous system, the phantom sensations that occasionally arose from it in ways that neuroscience understood mechanically, but that remained, experientially, one of the stranger aspects of living with limb loss. He knew this tissue well enough to recognize that what it was doing now was different from anything it had done before. He documented the difference carefully, in language that was as precise as he could make it, knowing that the quality of his documentation during this period would determine how much the experiment contributed to the research record regardless of its outcome. The warmth was accompanied by what he could only describe as a sense of biological activity, not pain, not quite sensation in the conventional sense, but something that his nervous system was registering as meaningful, as information rather than noise, as the body's way of communicating that something was occurring in that tissue that deserved attention. Shortly before 4 a.m, he called Martha. He had promised to call her if anything felt wrong, and nothing felt wrong, which was itself something he wanted her to know. The call was brief and quiet, the kind of conversation that two people who know each other very well have when the hour is late and the situation is serious, and words are less important than the simple exchange of presence. She was awake, had been watching the monitoring data on the screen in the study. She asked him how he felt, and he told her honestly that he felt strange and that the strangeness was not frightening. She was quiet for a moment and then told him to keep documenting everything, and to call her again in 2 hours. He said that he would, and meant it, and they ended the call and he returned to his notebook. Morning came in the particular way that Florida mornings come in the warmer months, not gradually but with a sudden quality of light that fills the sky before the sun has properly risen, a brightness that precedes its source by what seems like too long an interval, as though the day is impatient with the formality of sunrise. Connors watched this light arrive through the laboratory window, his monitoring log open beside him, and his vital signs stable across the night, and he felt the exhaustion of a sleepless night underneath the alertness that the significance of the situation was maintaining. He was also hungry, in a way that felt more insistent than his usual morning hunger. His metabolism apparently working harder than its normal baseline, which was consistent with what the theoretical framework would predict if the compound was doing what he hoped it was doing. He ate the food he had brought with him, sitting at the bench and continuing his documentation between bites, and he waited for enough daylight to make the examination he needed to make possible with adequate visual clarity, not trusting the artificial lighting of the laboratory for something this important. When the light was sufficient, he looked. The residual limb of his right arm had changed. The change was not dramatic in the way that transformation in stories tends to be dramatic, not sudden or visually overwhelming, but it was unambiguous to the eye of a man who had been looking at this particular piece of his anatomy for years, and who knew its contours and its surface characteristics with an intimacy that only long familiarity could produce. At the distal end of the residual limb, at the point where the amputation had been closed and healed into the rounded termination that he had learned to regard as simply the shape of his arm, there was new tissue. Not a great deal of it. Nothing that an observer unfamiliar with what had been there before would necessarily notice or remark upon. But new tissue, definitively and observably present where it had not been the previous evening. A small but unmistakable growth at the margin of the healed surface. He sat very still for a moment, looking at it. Then he documented what he saw in precise anatomical terms, measurements and visual characteristics, and the specific location relative to the landmarks of the existing tissue, the kind of documentation that a scientist makes when they are in the presence of something real and do not want the excitement of the moment to introduce any imprecision into the record. Then he sat back and allowed himself, for the space of a few full breaths, to simply feel what he felt. What he felt was not the wild elation of a moment he had sometimes imagined when, in less guarded moments, he had allowed himself to imagine the experiment succeeding. It was quieter than that, and deeper. It was the feeling of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and has just been given the first credible reason to believe that he might eventually be able to set it down. It was gratitude and relief, and a quality of wonder that had something in common with the feeling he'd had as a 9-year-old boy watching a skink regrow its tail in a Pennsylvania garden. The feeling of being present at something that the natural world was doing and that the mind could not fully contain. He called Martha again, and this time the call was longer. He described what he had observed in careful detail, reading from his notes so that the description would be accurate rather than shaped by emotion. And he heard in her silence the same quality of feeling that he was doing his best to hold carefully, the recognition that something real was happening, and that the realness of it was almost too large to take in all at once. She said his name, just once, in a way that contained everything the moment called for and more than language could efficiently carry. Then she asked if he was coming home, and he said that he would as soon as he had completed the morning's documentation and set up the monitoring protocols that would continue to track the compound's effects through the day. He was home by mid-morning. Billy was at school, which meant that the reunion between Connors and Martha was private, just the two of them in the kitchen of the house they had built their life in. Sitting across the table from each other with his documented findings between them and the Florida morning going warm and green outside the window, Martha read through his notes with the focused attention of a scientist reviewing data, asking clarifying questions where the documentation was less precise than she wanted it to be, and Connors answered everything fully and without the defensiveness that a less honest person might have felt, because this was Martha, and honesty between them was not an effort but a habit of years. When she had finished reading, she looked up at him and said, "It's working," not as a question, and not as a celebration, but as a statement of fact. The kind of statement that a careful scientist makes when the evidence has crossed the threshold from promising to compelling. He agreed that it appeared to be. She nodded slowly, looking at him in the way she looked at him when she was thinking about more than one thing at once, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, the left hand, the one that had learned to carry everything that two hands had once shared, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, in the particular silence of two people for whom words have temporarily become inadequate to what they are feeling. The days that followed were among the most extraordinary of Connor's scientific life, and the most extraordinary of his personal life, and the difficulty of separating these two things was itself a kind of measure of how completely the research had become a part of who he was. He continued going to the laboratory each day, maintaining his documentation with meticulous regularity, tracking the progress of the regeneration against the predictions of his theoretical framework and against the results from the animal studies, looking for divergences and consistencies with equal attention. The regeneration was proceeding faster than the animal models had predicted, which was both exciting and something to think carefully about, a deviation from the expected pattern that deserved investigation rather than simply celebration. The arm was growing back. This was the central and almost incomprehensible fact of those days, the fact that everything else organized itself around, that gave each morning its particular quality of anticipation and each evening its particular quality of gratitude. The tissue that was developing at the distal margin of his residual limb was differentiating, taking on the characteristics of specific tissue types rather than remaining as undifferentiated growth, and the process by which it was doing this appeared to be guided by something that his theoretical framework had predicted, but that seeing in practice was still astonishing. Some form of positional information stored in his own biology, his own body's retained knowledge of the correct form of a complete arm, which was now being consulted and enacted by the regenerative process the compound had initiated. Martha watched the progress with him, and Billy was told, carefully and in age-appropriate terms, that something was happening with his father's arm that they needed to observe and document, and that he should ask any questions he had, because questions were always good. Billy's response was to ask, with the directness of a child who has grown up in a household where scientific thinking is a daily practice, whether it hurt. Connors told him honestly that it felt strange but not painful, and Billy nodded with an expression of focused consideration, and then asked if he could watch, and Connors said that when there was more to see, he would show him. The strangeness that Connors had described to Billy was real and worth characterizing more precisely than that simple word allowed. The regenerating tissue was connected to his nervous system in ways that were producing sensory experiences he had no prior frame of reference for. Not the phantom sensations of the absent limb that he had experienced for years, which had a quality of memory about them, but something more present and more immediate, sensations that corresponded to actual tissue that was actually there, and that was, in some not yet fully developed way, beginning to participate in his sensory world. There were moments when the signals his nervous system was receiving from the regenerating limb were difficult to interpret, when the brain that had learned to live without this information was not entirely sure what to do with its return, and these moments had a quality of profound strangeness that he documented as carefully as he documented everything else. He was also sleeping differently. His sleep was deeper than usual, and longer, and populated with dreams that had a vividness and a physical quality that his ordinary dreams did not tend to have, as though the intensity of the biological work being done during the sleeping hours was expressing itself in the dreaming mind in some indirect but perceptible way. He woke from these dreams feeling not rested exactly, but somehow worked upon, the way he had felt after particularly demanding surgical procedures in his earlier career, as though his body had been occupied with something important while his conscious mind was absent, and the occupation had been thorough and serious. He noted all of this, and he noted also the changes in his appetite and his energy levels, and the specific quality of his physical awareness throughout the day, the heightened attention to temperature and texture and movement that suggested his sensory processing was operating at a slightly different calibration than its usual baseline. These changes were not alarming. They were within the range of what the theoretical framework would predict as accompaniments of the kind of cellular activity the compound was stimulating. But they were distinct and worth tracking carefully, and he tracked them with the same patient attention he brought to every other aspect of the process. 3 weeks after the initial injection, he stood before the mirror in the bathroom of his house, on a morning when the light was clear and direct and adequate for the kind of looking he needed to do, and he looked at his right arm, which was no longer a residual limb terminating in healed tissue, but something that was unmistakably and undeniably on its way to being a complete arm again, its form emerging from the process of regeneration with a fidelity to the original that exceeded even the most optimistic of his predictions. He stood there for a long time, looking at it in the mirror, and the man looking back at him was the same man who had woken in a military hospital years before, and understood what had been taken from him, but he was looking at something that the man in the military hospital had not dared to imagine. Billy came to find him after a while, as children do when a parent has been quiet in another room for longer than seems right, and stood in the bathroom doorway looking at his father with the open, attentive face that Connors had loved since the first time he saw it. He looked at his father's arm, at the emerging form of it that was visible now without any need for clinical explanation, and then he looked up at his father's face and said nothing for a moment, absorbing what he was seeing with the particular thoroughness of a child who takes important things seriously. Then he said quietly, "It worked," and Connors felt the truth of those two words move through him with a force that the most precise scientific language he possessed could not have carried as efficiently. "It worked," he agreed. And he looked at his son, and at his arm, and at the Florida morning visible through the window behind them, the light coming through the trees in the long, golden way of late summer, and he felt in the specific way that a man feels something he has worked toward for most of his adult life, the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment, the Pennsylvania garden and the medical school and the military hospital, and the years of patient work in the wetland laboratory, all of it present at once, all of it accounted for, all of it worth what it had cost. What he did not feel, because the feeling was still too new to perceive it, and because the joy of the moment was too full to leave room for the quieter signals that were already, beneath the surface of the extraordinary and the hopeful, beginning to ask to be noticed, was that the process he had initiated was not entirely finished with what he had designed it to do. That the compound, having been introduced into a living system of considerably greater complexity than the ones he had tested it in, was continuing to work in ways that his monitoring protocols were tracking and that his theoretical framework was interpreting, but that the living system itself was also doing something with the compound that the theoretical framework had not fully anticipated. The arm was nearly complete. The research had produced something that would change medicine and restore something he had believed was permanently gone. These things were true, and they were extraordinary, and they deserved every measure of gratitude and wonder that he was feeling. What was also true, quieter and slower, and not yet visible in any way that demanded immediate attention, was that the compound was still active in his system, still stimulating cellular processes that the initial regenerative goal did not entirely account for, still doing its work in the deep biological layers where the distinction between restoring what had been lost and transforming what remained had not yet, in the molecular language of chemistry and genetics, been clearly established. He would learn this later. For now, he looked at his son in the bathroom doorway, and at the arm that was coming back to him, and at the morning, and he was happy in the pure and simple way that a person is happy when something very important and very long awaited has finally, unambiguously, begun to come true. The first sign that something beyond the expected was occurring did not arrive with any drama. It did not announce itself in the way that crises tend to announce themselves in stories, with a sudden and unmistakable signal that compels immediate response. It came instead in the way that the most consequential things in Connor's experience had always come, quietly and incrementally, in the small deviations from the expected pattern that a less attentive observer might have dismissed as noise, but that a scientist of his caliber recognized as information, as the dataset beginning to tell a story that the hypothesis had not anticipated. The arm had completed its regeneration. This remained true and remained extraordinary, and the completion of it had been documented with the same careful attention that Connors had brought to every phase of the process. The arm was functional, the tissue had differentiated correctly, the musculature had developed with fidelity to the original, that continued to exceed his most optimistic predictions, and the nervous system integration, which he had expected to be the most challenging and most prolonged aspect of the recovery, had proceeded with a speed and a thoroughness that suggested the compound's influence on neural tissue was even more significant than the animal studies had indicated. He could use the arm. He could use it with a precision and a strength that belonged to a man who had never lost the use of it in the first place, which was itself a finding of considerable scientific importance, suggesting that the regenerative process had restored not merely the structural form of the limb, but something closer to its complete original biological specification. He had written all of this into the research record with the thoroughness it deserved, and had begun the careful process of thinking about how to present the findings in a form suitable for scientific publication, understanding that the documentation of a successful human application of a regenerative compound of this kind represented a contribution to the literature of enormous significance, one that required the most rigorous and complete presentation he could produce. He had also begun thinking about the next steps, about the animal safety studies that would need to be extended and deepened before any broader human application could be considered, about the institutional partnerships that would be necessary to move from a single self-administered case study to anything approaching a clinical program. These were the thoughts that occupied the foreground of his attention during the weeks following the arm's completion, and it was precisely because these thoughts occupied the foreground that the things occurring in the background took longer to move into conscious focus than they might otherwise have done. He was a man whose attention had been trained over decades to concentrate on what was scientifically important, and what was scientifically important in his current assessment was the successful outcome of the primary experimental objective. The other things, the things that did not fit neatly into that assessment, required more time to accumulate to the threshold of recognition. The skin on his right arm, the newly regenerated skin, had a texture that was not quite the texture of the skin on the rest of his body. He had noticed this early, and had attributed it to the newness of the tissue, to the reasonable expectation that regenerated skin might have a slightly different surface character than skin that had been present for decades, that had weathered sun and wind and the ordinary physical history of an adult life. This was a plausible explanation, and he had accepted it, noting it in his documentation without particular concern, and moving on to the aspects of the arm's function that seemed more immediately significant. But the texture was not normalizing. Weeks after the regeneration was complete, the skin of his right arm retained the slightly roughened, slightly scaled quality that he had attributed to newness, and if anything, it was becoming more pronounced rather than less, the surface of the skin developing a pattern of fine scaling that was not consistent with any normal variation in human skin texture that his medical training had prepared him to recognize. He looked at it one morning in the clear light of the laboratory and understood, with the part of his mind that had been trained not to look away from findings that did not fit the expected pattern, that this was not a feature of new tissue settling into its final form. It was something else. He documented it and thought about what it might mean, running through the theoretical possibilities with the systematic attention of someone who is trying very hard to be objective about something that personal investment makes objectivity difficult to achieve. The scaling pattern had a quality that he recognized from his years of working with reptilian specimens, not dramatically, not in a way that an observer without his specific expertise would necessarily notice or name, but recognizably present once the comparison had been made in the associative pathways of a mind steeped in the biology of lizards. His own skin was developing a pattern that had something in common with the integumentary structure of the animals, whose biology had provided the foundation for the compound he had introduced into his system. This was, he understood, a finding of significant concern. The theoretical framework he had developed had not predicted this kind of cross-species morphological expression. The compound was designed to reactivate genetic regulatory mechanisms that were evolutionarily related to those active in lizard regeneration, but it was not designed to produce lizard tissue in a human body. The fact that something like this appeared to be occurring suggested that the compound's effects on his genome were not as precisely targeted as his design had intended, that the reactivation of dormant regulatory sequences was producing effects beyond those he had planned for. He told Martha that evening, presenting the finding with the same direct honesty he brought to everything between them, reading from his documentation rather than relying on unmediated description, giving her the data before the interpretation so that she could form her own assessment before hearing his. She looked at the arm, at the scaling that was visible now without any need for clinical magnification, and she was quiet for longer than her usual thoughtful silences lasted, which told him something about what she was feeling that she was not yet ready to put into words. What she said when she spoke was that they needed to work on a reversal protocol immediately, not eventually. Not after further observation to determine whether the changes continued to progress, but immediately now because the longer the compound remained active in his system, without counteraction, the more opportunity it had to produce effects that might become progressively more difficult to address. She was right about this, as the clinical logic was straightforward, and he agreed with her without reservation, though the agreement cost him something that he acknowledged privately and did not burden her with, the recognition that the work of reversing the compound's effects would necessarily delay and complicate the work of developing it into the clinical tool he had hoped it would become. He began the reversal research that week. The problem was genuinely difficult, as reversal problems in biochemistry tend to be more complex than the original intervention, because undoing what a compound has done to a living system requires understanding not only the mechanism of the original action but the secondary and tertiary effects that the living system has produced in response, the ways in which the body has reorganized itself around the intervention and built new states of equilibrium that the reversal must account for. He worked on it with the same systematic attention he had brought to every previous phase of the research, but he was working now under a pressure that the earlier phases had not carried, because the thing he was trying to reverse was happening in his own body, and the body was not waiting for him to find the answer before continuing to change. The changes accelerated during this period. The scaling that had begun on his right arm spread, gradually and then less gradually, to other areas, the skin of his neck and his left hand, and eventually his face showing the same roughening and patterning that had first appeared on the regenerated limb. His temperature regulation shifted, his body running warmer than it had before, more comfortable in the heat of the Florida days than he had ever been, less comfortable in the cooler temperatures of the laboratory's air conditioning. His appetite changed in ways that were difficult to manage in the context of normal domestic life, the specific nutritional preferences of his altered metabolism diverging from what his household's ordinary food supplies provided, in directions that he documented with clinical detachment and found personally disturbing. the psychological changes were the most difficult to document and the most frightening to experience. They did not arrive as sudden alterations in his consciousness or dramatic shifts in his personality that he or Martha could point to and name clearly. They arrived in the subtler form of changes in the quality of his thinking, in what his attention was drawn toward and what felt urgent and what felt less interesting than it previously had. The complex, layered, deeply humanistic intellectual life that had defined him, the love of ideas and of language and of the careful building of understanding through observation and reasoning and the honest acknowledgement of what was not yet known, retained its presence but felt, at moments, somehow less immediately compelling than other things, more instinctual things, older things that his rational mind recognized as belonging to a different layer of biological existence than the one he normally inhabited. He struggled to describe this in his documentation. The language available to him was the language of a human consciousness trying to describe the intrusion of something that did not operate in language, and the inadequacy of the description was itself a piece of information, an indication that what was happening was not merely physical, but was touching something in the architecture of his selfhood that he did not have good tools for observing from the inside. He wrote what he could, in the careful sentences of a scientist who is committed to honesty regardless of what honesty requires him to say, and he read what he had written and understood that the picture it produced was incomplete, and that the incompleteness was not a failure of documentation, but a feature of the phenomenon being documented. Martha knew. She knew in the way that a person who has lived closely alongside another person for many years knows things that have not been said, that are visible in the small daily behaviours and the quality of presence that constitutes the texture of a long-shared life. She watched him with a careful attention that she tried not to make feel like surveillance, because she understood that being watched carefully by someone who's afraid for you is its own kind of burden, and she did not want to add that burden to everything else he was carrying. But she watched, and what she saw frightened her in a way that she held as steadily as she could, converting the fear into action, into the long hours she spent working alongside him on the reversal protocol, into the practical management of the household, in ways that reduced the demands on him and created the conditions for the research to proceed as efficiently as possible. Billy was told that his father was not feeling well, that the medicine that had helped his arm was also causing some side effects that needed to be addressed, and that things would be complicated for a while, but that his father was working on fixing it. Billy was old enough to understand that this explanation was simplified, and young enough to accept the simplification. Though Connors could see in his son's eyes, in the particular quality of attention that Billy brought to his father during this period, the understanding that the situation was more serious than the simple version of it suggested. He did not press for more detail, which was a form of courtesy that Connors recognized and was grateful for, and he helped around the house more than usual, in the quiet, unannounced way of a child who understands that helping is needed without needing to be asked. The reversal compound that Connors was developing was making progress, but the progress was slower than the changes in his body, and the gap between the pace of the research and the pace of the transformation was the central fact of his days during this period. The thing that organized everything else and gave it its particular quality of urgency. He worked longer hours and slept less, which the altered metabolism of his changing physiology seemed to accommodate more readily than his previous biology would have, but which also meant that the exhaustion of sustained intellectual effort accumulated without the full restoration that adequate sleep had always previously provided. There were nights when he sat alone in the laboratory, after Martha had gone home, working through the biochemical calculations that the reversal protocol required, and felt the particular strangeness of being a man who was working to undo something in himself, while that something continued to proceed. He was, in those hours, both the researcher and the subject in a more complete and more uncomfortable sense than he had been at the beginning of the experiment, because then the duality had been manageable. The clinical observer and the hopeful patient existing in reasonable harmony within the same person. Now the duality was becoming a conflict, the human scientist and the changing organism pulling in directions that were increasingly difficult to reconcile within a single coherent identity. He did not fully understand during this period the extent to which the conflict was not merely psychological, but biological, not merely the difficulty of being objective about one's own condition, but something more fundamental, a literal division within his cellular architecture between the human regulatory systems that had governed his biology since birth, and the reptilian regulatory sequences that the compound had reactivated and that were, with increasing confidence and decreasing deference to their human context, asserting their own developmental logic. The compound had been designed to reactivate dormant sequences for a specific and limited purpose. It had done this, and in doing this it had also done something more, had handed those sequences a degree of influence over his cellular environment that they were not content to exercise narrowly. The transformation, when it reached the point that Connors could no longer think of what was happening to him as a side effect or a complication or a problem in need of a biochemical solution, came not as a single event but as the crossing of a threshold that had been approaching for weeks. He was in the laboratory, late in the evening, working on the reversal protocol, when the quality of his consciousness shifted in a way that he was aware of with a sudden and terrible clarity. Aware of, as a man is aware of the moment when the ground underfoot changes from solid to uncertain, when what has felt stable reveals itself to have been simply stable enough, and the difference between those two things becomes immediately and completely apparent. The man who sat at the laboratory bench in those final moments before the threshold was crossed was still Curt Connors, still the sum of everything that name contained, the boy from Pennsylvania, and the surgeon, and the researcher, and the husband, and the father, still in possession of the full complexity of a human life, lived carefully and with genuine love for the people, and the work, and the world that had shaped him. He was frightened, and the fear was the fear of a man who understands what is happening to him and cannot stop it, which is one of the oldest and most particular kinds of human fear. He reached for his documentation notebook, because the habit of documentation was so deeply written into who he was that even in this moment it was the impulse that surfaced, the instinct to record, to bear witness, to leave an account. He wrote one sentence. It was not a scientific observation. It was not a data point or a methodological note or a clinical description of what he was experiencing in terms that could be incorporated into the research record. It was the sentence that the man he was wrote for the person he had been and for the people who loved him, the sentence that contained, in its few words, everything that the notebooks and the papers and the years of careful work had been building toward, and that none of them, in all their thoroughness, had quite managed to say. He wrote, "Martha, I'm sorry, I'm still here." And then the threshold closed behind him, and what rose in the place where Curt Connors had been was older than Curt Connors, older than medicine or science or the careful human project of understanding the natural world in order to help the people living in it, something that did not know about Pennsylvania gardens or military hospitals, or the specific weight of a father's love for his son, something that knew only what it needed and what it would do to meet that need, something that looked out through eyes that had changed their colour and their quality and their relationship to the world they were seeing, and found the world very large and very present and very immediate, in the way that the world is immediate to creatures that live entirely within it rather than partially above it. The laboratory was quiet. The notebooks were on the shelves. The documentation of years of work sat in its careful order. The record of a human mind's sustained engagement with one of the deepest questions of biology, interrupted now at the moment of its most significant and most terrible finding. Outside, the Florida night was doing what it always did, sustaining and renewing and persisting in its ancient biological rhythms, indifferent to the specific drama that had just occurred within the low building at the wetland's edge. The lizard moved through the laboratory with a certainty and a directness that had nothing in common with the patient, methodical movements of the man who had worked there, and pushed open the door that led to the outside and went into the night, toward the water and the darkness and the deep vegetative world that something in its cellular memory recognized as home. The reports that reached New York in the days following that night were the kind of reports that a city accustomed to extraordinary things still managed to find extraordinary. Fragmented accounts from residents of the communities bordering the Everglades of something large and reptilian moving through the wetlands with a speed and a purposefulness that did not belong to any creature the local wildlife services could readily account for. The accounts were inconsistent in their details, as eyewitness accounts of unexpected things always are, shaped by the darkness and the distance and the particular quality of fear that attends the encounter with something that does not fit any available category. But they were consistent in their essential character, in the sense they conveyed of something genuinely outside the ordinary range of the Florida wilderness, something that the ordinary frameworks for understanding that wilderness were not adequate to contain. The scientific community that might have been expected to take a particular interest in these reports was otherwise occupied with a fact that it found more immediately pressing than unverified wildlife sightings, which was the disappearance of Dr. Curt Connors from his laboratory and from his home. The laboratory had been found in its usual state of careful organisation, with the exception of a door left open to the outside and a single notebook lying on the bench at an angle that suggested it had been left in haste, rather than placed with the deliberate tidiness that characterised Connors' usual relationship to his workspace. Martha Connors had reported her husband missing to the local authorities, who had conducted the kind of search that their resources and jurisdiction allowed, and had found nothing. The research community had been notified through the institutional channels that connected Connors to his professional world, and the notifications had produced concern and confusion and a great deal of well-intentioned inquiry that had so far yielded nothing useful. It was the combination of these two facts, the creature in the wetlands and the missing scientist, that eventually produced a connection in the mind of someone with the particular kind of broad and associative intelligence that made such connections possible, that someone was Peter Parker, who read about both of them in the course of the research he did compulsively and constantly, as both a journalist and a person whose professional life required him to stay informed about events that might have implications beyond their surface appearance. He had known of Connors' work, had read several of his published papers with a genuine scientific interest of a person who had been formally trained in the field and who recognised the quality of the thinking they represented. The conjunction of a missing biochemist who studied reptilian regeneration and a large unidentified reptilian creature appearing in the wetlands near his laboratory was not, to a mind like Peter Parker's, a conjunction that required a great deal of additional inference to become a hypothesis worth investigating. He made arrangements to go to Florida. This required the kind of logistical creativity that the dual life of someone in Peter's situation always required, the construction of a cover story adequate to explain his absence from his regular responsibilities, the preparation of equipment appropriate to both the journalistic and the heroic dimensions of what he anticipated encountering, the management of the domestic and professional obligations that did not simply pause because a situation in another part of the country appeared to require his attention. He was experienced at this kind of management, had been doing it for long enough that the practical dimensions of it had become largely automatic, but it never ceased to carry the particular low-level weight of a life organised around necessary deception, the cost that the secret imposed simply by being kept. He flew to Florida on a Thursday morning, carrying a camera bag that contained both the equipment his press credentials legitimised and the equipment that his other identity required, and he arrived in the humid, sun-saturated world of southern Florida with the specific quality of alertness that he brought to situations where the parameters of what he was walking into were genuinely uncertain. The heat was different from New York heat, more total, more present, more insistent in its claim on the body's attention. The light was different too, flatter and more even, without the vertical drama of light moving between tall buildings, lying instead across a landscape that was wide and low and green, in a way that suggested the world here had different priorities than the world he was more accustomed to. He drove from the airport toward the community nearest to the Connors laboratory, through a landscape that changed gradually from the developed infrastructure of the airport's surroundings to something older and less managed, the vegetation thickening and the road narrowing and the sky opening up in the way that skies do when the structures that usually interrupt them become less frequent. He was aware, in the particular way that his enhanced senses made him aware of things that ordinary perception might have taken longer to register, of the specific quality of the environment he was entering, the density and complexity of a living system that operated on its own terms and according to its own logic, largely indifferent to the human purposes that occasionally moved through it. The Connors house was modest and well kept, in the way that the homes of people who live primarily in their minds tend to be, cared for but not fussed over. Its garden showing the particular combination of deliberate planting and natural encroachment that results when someone with genuine interest in the local ecology lives in a place long enough to let it partly have its way. Martha Connors opened the door before he reached it, which told him that she had been watching for someone, that she had been alert to the possibility of a visitor in a way that suggested she had been hoping for one, or perhaps that she had made the same kind of calls and sent the same kind of messages that a person in her situation would send when the official channels of assistance had proven inadequate to the specific nature of the problem she was facing. She was a composed woman. This was the first and most durable impression that Peter took from their initial meeting, that she was someone who had organised her considerable interior resources into a form adequate to what was being asked of her, and who was maintaining that organisation through an act of will that was visible to anyone paying close enough attention. She was afraid, deeply and specifically afraid in the way that only a person who understands exactly what they are afraid of can be afraid. But she was not permitting the fear to disorganise her, because disorganisation would not help Curt, and she had decided, with the same clear practicality that characterised everything he would come to understand about her, that what would help Curt was the only thing worth spending her energy on. She brought him into the kitchen, which was the room in the house that felt most inhabited, most recently occupied by the daily life of a family, and she made coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone performing a routine while thinking about something else entirely, and she told him what she knew. She told it in order and without embellishment. The research and the decision and the initial success and the changes that had followed, and the night of the final transformation, which she had not witnessed but whose occurrence she had understood from the evidence available to her, the open laboratory door and the notebook on the bench and the sentence her husband had written in the last minutes of his full possession of himself, which she had read and which she had not shared with the authorities, because she had understood that sharing it would have required explaining things that she was not prepared to explain to people who did not have the context to understand them. Peter listened with the full attention that the situation required, asking questions at the points where his understanding needed more information to stay accurate, not performing sympathy but feeling it genuinely. In the specific way that the story of a good person, in a terrible situation, produces genuine feeling in a person capable of recognizing the difference between tragedy and its imitation. He thought about what she was telling him in two registers simultaneously, the scientific register in which he was following the logic of the research in its failure mode and understanding the biochemical dimensions of what had occurred, and the human register in which he was receiving the account of a man he respected who had made a choice out of love and patience and had been overtaken by consequences he had not designed and could not control. Billy appeared at the kitchen doorway partway through the conversation, a boy of an age that Peter estimated as somewhere around 11 or 12, with his father's quality of careful attention visible in his face and his mother's composure visible in his bearing. He looked at Peter with the direct, assessing look of a child who has been made more serious than his years by circumstances that serious things produce, and Peter looked back at him with a respect that Billy appeared to register and appreciate. Martha introduced them simply, without elaborate explanation of who Peter was or why he was there, and Billy sat down at the kitchen table and listened to the rest of the conversation with the stillness of someone who understood that being allowed to remain in the room was a form of trust that he intended to honour. The laboratory was where Peter went next, walking there with Martha through the late afternoon heat, while Billy stayed at the house, the short distance between the home and the workplace feeling in that context like a passage between two different qualities of meaning. Martha unlocked the laboratory and stood in the doorway while Peter moved through it, looking at everything with the dual attention of a scientist and someone whose other set of skills was also engaged, reading the room for what it could tell him about what had happened there and what he might need to know to address what had followed. The notebooks were extraordinary. He understood this immediately, even reading them in the compressed and selective way that the circumstances allowed, with his scientific training active and his respect for the quality of the work fully present. Connors had been doing something genuinely significant here, something that the interrupted state of it made more poignant rather than less. The record of years of careful and brilliant work ending in a single sentence on an otherwise blank page that Peter read, and then read again, and then did not read a third time because 2 readings had been sufficient to understand what it contained and what it had cost the person who had written it. He spent several hours in the laboratory, reviewing the documentation and the research materials with the focused efficiency of someone who needs to understand a great deal in a limited time and who has the intellectual equipment to do so. And he also did the other kind of work that the situation required, the assessment of what the physical evidence told him about the creature that had left through the open door and where it might be found and what its capabilities were likely to include. He worked from Connor's own research, from the papers and the laboratory notes and the specimen data, building a picture of what the compound's effects on a human physiology would be expected to produce if the transformation had progressed to the degree that Martha's account and the outside reports together suggested, the picture that emerged was of something considerably more formidable than the large but essentially animal creature that the civilian reports implied. Connors' research had made clear that the reptilian regulatory sequences he had been working with were not those of any single extant lizard species, but represented a synthesized reactivation of sequences distributed across the evolutionary history of reptilian biology, sequences that in their individual species context produced impressive but bounded capabilities, but that in their synthesized combination, operating in the physiological context of a large adult human male with an already exceptional physical constitution, would be expected to produce something whose strength and speed and sensory capabilities exceeded those of any animal in the local ecosystem by a considerable margin. This was not a creature that could be approached carelessly or addressed with the assumption that size and unfamiliarity were its only genuinely dangerous characteristics. He went into the wetlands the following morning. He went as Spider-Man, which was both the practically appropriate choice given what he might encounter, and the emotionally appropriate choice given that what he was doing was not journalism, but something that required the full commitment of everything he was capable of bringing to a situation. The wetlands in the early morning had a quality that was entirely their own, a density of biological presence, and a particular quality of light and sound that was unlike anything in his experience of the world. The water and the vegetation and the sky existing in a relationship of mutual reflection that made the boundaries between them feel less fixed than they usually did, everything present in everything else. The world in this place less divided than the world he was more accustomed to navigating. He moved through it with his enhanced senses fully engaged, tracking the signs that a creature of the lizard's size and capability would leave in an environment like this. The disturbances in the water and the vegetation, and the soft ground at the wetlands' margins that told a story of passage and habitation to anyone with the perceptual equipment to read them. The signs were not difficult to find. Whatever the lizard was in terms of its intelligence and its motivations, it was not making any particular effort to conceal its presence, moving through the wetlands with a directness and a confidence that suggested a creature that did not feel the need to hide, that understood its environment as something it belonged to rather than something it was traversing with the careful vulnerability of a visitor. He found it in the late morning, in a part of the wetland where the cypress trees were densest, and the water was still and dark, and the light came through the canopy in the filtered green-tinged way of light that has passed through a great deal of living matter before reaching the surface it illuminates. The lizard was at rest beside the water, in the particular stillness of a reptilian creature that is not sleeping, but is conserving energy in the way that cold-blooded biology, or something that had moved in the direction of cold-blooded biology, was inclined to do in the warmer hours of the day. It was larger than Peter had expected, even accounting for what the research had suggested. Large in a way that registered not just as a measurement, but as a presence, as something that altered the quality of the space it occupied simply by being in it. He stayed very still in the branches of a cypress at the margin of the clearing, looking at it with the full attention of his enhanced perception, and what he felt in that moment was not the straightforward alertness of a hero encountering a threat, but something more complicated, a layered response that included the alertness, but also included the specific sorrow of recognizing in the creature below him the presence, however buried and however altered, of the man whose notebooks he had spent the previous afternoon reading, the man whose sentence on the last page of the last notebook he had read twice and then set down with care. The lizard raised its head, and the eyes that looked in his direction were not the eyes of an animal and not the eyes of Curtis Connors, but something that existed in the terrible space between those two things, old and present and entirely serious, in a way that the animal world and the human world shared without either being able to claim it entirely. Peter did not move. The lizard did not move. The wetland held them both in its ancient, patient stillness, the water reflecting the sky in the dark space between the cypress roots, the light moving slowly through its daily arc above the canopy. The encounter that followed was brief and inconclusive in the conventional heroic sense, which is to say that it ended without a clear victor, and without the resolution that a simpler story might have demanded of it. Peter deploying his abilities with the careful restraint of someone who understood that the goal was not to defeat, but to survive and to learn. the lizard responding with a speed and a power that confirmed the theoretical picture the researcher had painted and added to it the specific, immediate knowledge of what those capabilities felt like in practice, which was considerably more instructive and considerably more humbling than any amount of prior preparation had quite managed to convey. He disengaged when disengagement became the clearly appropriate choice, moving through the cypress canopy with the agility that was his most reliable advantage, in an environment where the lizard's strength and territorial familiarity were significant compensating factors, and he put enough distance between himself and the creature to allow his assessment of the situation to proceed without the pressure of immediate physical threat. He was not hurt in any serious way, which he noted with the professional satisfaction of someone who has correctly assessed the parameters of a situation and acted accordingly, and he was considerably better informed about what he was dealing with than he had been an hour earlier, which was the outcome he had been working toward. He returned to the Connors house in the early afternoon and sat again at the kitchen table with Martha and told her what he had found and what he had observed and what he now believed about the situation and what he thought could be done about it. Martha listened with the same composed attention she had brought to everything, asking the precise and useful questions that her scientific training and her intimate knowledge of the research made possible, contributing to the conversation the specific knowledge about the compound and its mechanisms that he needed, and that only she, of all the people currently available to him, was fully positioned to provide. Billy sat at the table again, and again listened without interrupting, and at the end of the conversation he asked one question, quietly and directly, which was whether his father was still in there. Peter looked at him for a moment and looked at Martha, and then looked back at Billy and said, with the honesty that the boy's seriousness deserved, and that the situation, despite all its complexity, seemed actually to support, that yes, he believed so, that what he had seen in the wetland had not been only the creature the compound had produced, but something that the creature and the man together constituted, something that the research might yet be able to address if they were careful, and if they were patient, and if they used everything that Connors himself had already given them in the form of the years of work documented in the notebooks on the laboratory shelves. Billy nodded, with the gravity of a boy who has taken in a serious answer to a serious question and is doing the work of understanding what it means. Outside the kitchen window, the Florida afternoon was doing what Florida afternoons do, generating the slow build of cloud that produces the reliable daily rain of the wet season, the sky darkening in its theatrical subtropical way toward the brief, intense downpour that would clear and leave the world washed and steaming and more intensely green than it had been before. The rain, when it came, sounded on the roof of the Connors house with the steady, patient rhythm of something that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to continue, and Peter sat at the table and listened to it and thought about what came next. The antidote was not something that could be invented from nothing. This was the first and most important thing that Peter understood as he sat in Connors' laboratory that evening, the notebooks open around him, and the research documentation spread across the bench in the organised way that Martha had helped him arrange. Pulling the most relevant sections to the surface so that the picture they together formed was as complete and as navigable as possible. The antidote was not something that needed to be invented, because the man who had created the compound had also, in the course of his meticulous and honest documentation of everything the research produced, created the intellectual foundation from which a reversal agent could be derived. Connors had begun this work himself, in the weeks between the first signs of change and the final transformation, and what he had left behind in his notebooks was not a finished solution, but something nearly as valuable, a clearly reasoned partial solution, the work of a brilliant mind that had been racing against its own diminishment, and had gotten further than anyone who had not read those notebooks would have had reason to expect. Peter read those sections with the full engagement of his scientific training, and with the additional motivation of someone who had sat across a kitchen table from a woman holding herself together by will alone, and a boy who had asked whether his father was still in there and had received a promise implicit in the answer given. He read carefully and he read completely, not skimming for the conclusions but following the reasoning from its foundations, understanding that the quality of what he could build on this foundation depended on the quality of his understanding of the foundation itself. Connors had been working toward a compound that would interfere with the expression of the reactivated reptilian regulatory sequences without disrupting the normal human cellular machinery that those sequences had become entangled with during the transformation process. The problem, as Connors had framed it in his notes, was one of specificity, of finding a biochemical intervention precise enough to target the introduced regulatory activity without producing collateral effects on the human biology it was embedded in. The partial solution that Connors had developed before the transformation interrupted his work was elegant in the way that good biochemistry is elegant, built on a clear theoretical logic and supported by preliminary experimental evidence that, while not yet sufficient to constitute proof, was sufficient to constitute a well-founded and carefully justified hypothesis. Peter understood the elegance and respected it, and built on it, working through the evening hours at the laboratory bench with the focused efficiency of someone who has a great deal to do and a clear enough understanding of what needs doing to proceed without the false starts and wasted effort that uncertainty would have introduced. Martha worked alongside him. This was not a courtesy or a gesture of inclusion, but a practical necessity that both of them understood without needing to discuss, because Martha's knowledge of the compound and of Connors' specific biochemical approach to the reversal problem was not supplementary to Peter's scientific understanding, but genuinely complementary to it, filling in dimensions of the picture that his reading of the notebooks, however thorough, could not fully replace. She had listened to Connors think through this problem across many evenings, had asked the questions and received the answers, and formed her own understanding of the reasoning in the specific way that a person who is both a trained scientist and the most attentive audience a researcher could have forms understanding, deeply, and from multiple angles at once. She knew things about what Connors had been trying to do that were not fully written in the notebooks, because they had existed primarily in conversation, in the thinking aloud that a person does with the person they trust most, and she brought these things to the work at the bench, with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Billy came to the laboratory after dinner, carrying a plate of food for each of them that he set down on the one clear section of bench, with the practical care of someone performing a useful task, rather than making a sympathetic gesture. And he stayed for a while, sitting on the stool in the corner where he had always sat when he visited his father's workspace, watching them work with the particular quality of attention that was his inheritance from the man they were working to recover. He did not ask questions during these hours, understanding that the kind of concentration the work required was not compatible with the interruption of conversation, but his presence had a quality that Peter was aware of and that Martha was clearly sustained by, the presence of someone for whom the outcome of what they were doing was not abstract or professional, but entirely and immediately personal. The compound that began to take shape over the following days of work was not identical to what Connors had been developing before the transformation, because Peter's specific biochemical knowledge and the particular angle of his approach to the specificity problem produced modifications to the theoretical design that the evidence suggested were improvements, refinements that addressed some of the uncertainties that Connors' own notes had flagged as unresolved. Peter brought these modifications to Martha with the same honesty he brought to everything in his life that mattered, not presenting them as definitive advances but as possibilities that the logic supported and that he believed were worth pursuing, asking for her assessment with the genuine deference of someone who understands that good science is not produced by any single mind working alone, but by the collision and collaboration of multiple perspectives on a shared problem. She assessed them carefully, over the course of an evening in which they sat on either side of the laboratory bench and worked through the reasoning together in the same kind of extended, probing conversation that she had conducted with Connors across years of shared work, and she concluded that the modifications were sound and that the compound as revised represented the best available approach to the reversal problem given the materials and the time they had. This conclusion was delivered with the measured confidence of a scientist who has thought something through fully and arrived at a position she's prepared to defend, and Peter received it with the corresponding confidence of someone who has had their reasoning tested by a worthy interlocutor and found adequate. The synthesis of the compound required several days of careful laboratory work, proceeding through the steps that the protocol specified with the methodical attention that the precision of the task demanded. Peter worked with his hands in the way that his scientific training had taught him to work, carefully and without haste, checking each step against the documentation and verifying each result before proceeding to the next, understanding that the quality of the final compound depended on the quality of every individual step in its preparation, and that a compound of this kind, intended for administration to a living person under difficult circumstances, admitted no margin for the kind of error that carelessness or impatience could introduce. Martha synthesized portions of the compound alongside him, her biochemistry training directly applicable to the preparation steps that her knowledge of the relevant chemistry made accessible, and the collaboration between them in these hours had the specific quality of trust that develops between two people, working together on something important, something that matters enough to require the best that both of them can bring, and that rewards the bringing of it with the particular satisfaction of work done well toward a purpose that justifies the effort. The question of how to administer the compound to the lizard was in some ways the most practically challenging aspect of the entire undertaking, more immediately demanding than the biochemical work, because it required a solution not to a theoretical problem but to a physical one, the problem of making contact with a creature of considerable strength and speed and territorial instincts that had no reason to cooperate with what was being attempted, and several strong reasons to resist it. Peter thought through the options with the same systematic attention he had brought to the research, considering and discarding approaches that the lizard's capabilities made impractical, working toward a plan that used his own particular abilities, in combination with what the laboratory and the environment offered. The plan he arrived at was not elegant in the way that the biochemistry had been elegant. It was the kind of plan that field conditions produce rather than laboratory conditions, shaped by the constraints of the real rather than the freedoms of the theoretical. But it was workable in the specific sense that mattered, which was that it had a reasonable probability of achieving the intended outcome without requiring either the lizard's cooperation or a confrontation that prioritized defeat over restoration. The compound needed to be introduced into the lizard system. The method of introduction needed to be one that Peter could execute given the physical realities of encountering the creature in its wetland environment. The window of opportunity, once created, would be brief, and everything that happened before that window opened needed to be preparation for using it fully. He went back into the wetlands the following morning, and the morning after that, not yet attempting the administration but learning the creature's patterns in the specific environment it had claimed, the routes it travelled and the places it rested, and the times of day when its activity was highest, and when it was most settled into the conserving stillness of a creature that had found a place where it felt adequately secure. He was careful during these observation sessions to maintain a distance and a stillness that did not trigger the territorial responses he had encountered on the first day, moving through the cypress canopy with the quietness that his abilities made possible, watching and learning and building the picture he needed. On the fourth day he went with the compound prepared, and with the specific, focused intention of someone who has completed the preparation and is ready for what the preparation has been for. The morning was clear and warm in the way of Florida mornings in the dry season, the sky a deep and uncomplicated blue above the canopy, the water in the wetland holding the colour of it, in the long still spaces between the cypress roots. He found the lizard in the place he had come to expect to find it at this hour, and he stayed in the canopy above and slightly to the west of it, in a position that his observation sessions had established as adequate for the approach he'd planned. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, though it involved the full deployment of everything Peter was capable of, and tested the limits of his agility and his timing in ways that left him with a thorough physical awareness of just how formidable the creature below him actually was in practice. He moved when the moment was right, dropping from the canopy with the speed that surprise and trajectory could provide, making contact with the lizard's shoulder and administering the compound in the window of time that the initial shock of the contact created before the creature's reflexes fully engaged, and then disengaging with the speed that his own capabilities made possible, while the lizard's responding movements closed the space where he had been a fraction of a second after he had ceased to be in it. He put distance between himself and the creature, and found a position in the canopy from which he could observe without being immediately accessible, and he watched, and he waited with the patience that the situation required, which was the patience of someone who has done what could be done, and must now trust the work to do what the work was designed to do. The reversal, when it began, was visible from his observation position as a change in the quality of the creature's movement, and then in its posture, and then, gradually and with the particular slowness of a biological process reversing the work of weeks, in the form of what was present in the clearing below him. It was not a rapid transformation. It was not the kind of dramatic, instantaneous change that stories tend to prefer, because instantaneous change is easier to witness and easier to describe than the slow, ambiguous, effortful process of a living system returning to a previous state. It took time, and the time it took had a quality of its own, a suspended quality, the world holding its breath around a process that was either going to work or was not, and that would not resolve the question for anyone watching until it had finished doing what it was going to do. What was in the clearing when the process had run its course was a man. A man lying on the ground at the edge of the still water, exhausted in the specific way that a person is exhausted when their body has been through something that the ordinary vocabulary of physical effort does not adequately cover, but a man, present and complete in the way that the sentence on the last page of the last notebook had insisted he still was. Peter came down from the canopy and crossed the clearing and crouched beside him, and Curt Connors opened his eyes and looked at the person beside him with the particular quality of a returning consciousness that is taking careful inventory of where it is and what surrounds it and what the surrounding world appears to contain. He said nothing for a long moment. Peter said nothing either, understanding that the moment belonged to the man returning to himself, and that the appropriate response to witnessing someone's return to themselves was not to fill the space with words, but to be present in it, with the simple and respectful attention that presence, when it is genuine, can offer. Then Connors said, quietly and with the specific exhaustion of someone for whom even speech requires effort, "How bad was it?" It was not quite a question, not inflected with the uncertainty that a question carries, but a request for honest accounting from someone who was prepared to receive honest accounting, because the alternative, the softened and partial version of the truth, would have been an insult to the quality of his intelligence and his character. Peter told him honestly, with the care and the completeness that the question deserved, what the reports had indicated, and what he himself had observed, and what Martha had told him of the days preceding the transformation. Connors listened with his eyes closed, receiving the account with the stillness of someone who is processing something difficult and has chosen stillness as the container for that processing. When Peter finished, Connors was quiet for a while, and then he said, "My family," and Peter told him that his family was well and was waiting for him, and something in the quality of Connors' stillness changed, became less the stillness of someone holding difficult information, and more the stillness of someone who has just been given the thing they most needed and is taking the time to fully receive it. Peter helped him to his feet, and they walked together out of the wetlands and into the morning, through the cypress trees and the still water, and the filtered light of a Florida day that was doing what Florida days do regardless of what occurs within them, persisting in its warm and living abundance, offering the world its particular quality of biological generosity without condition or commentary. The house was visible through the trees when they reached the wetland's margin, and Martha was in the garden, and she saw them coming, and she walked toward them with the composed and deliberate pace of a woman who has been waiting for something and has decided that the waiting is finished. Billy came out of the house at a run. The Florida night has settled fully now, and the wetlands are doing what they have always done, sustaining and renewing and persisting in the ancient biological patience that Curt Connors spent his life trying to understand, and that understood him, in its way, in return. There is a light still on in the laboratory. There is always, in the story of a person like Curtis Connors, a light still on somewhere, the evidence of a mind that has not stopped working, a heart that has not stopped hoping, a man who has been through something that would have ended lesser people, and has chosen, with the quiet and unspectacular courage that is the most durable kind, to continue. His story asks us nothing dramatic. It asks only what all the most honest stories ask, that we recognize in his struggle something that belongs to all of us, the effort to remain ourselves when circumstances press toward transformation, the love that persists through the worst of what we become, the patient work of returning to who we were always trying to be. Let that recognition settle into you now like warmth, like the particular piece of a question that does not need answering tonight. The water is still, the cypress trees are standing, the light is on. Rest now. You have come a long way, and you're exactly where you're meant to be.